Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event. Real quick, if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that you had to register for it separately from the main event registration. If you have not registered for CLE credit specifically, please register and submit payment at the link that I will put in the chat momentarily. CLE attendee verification passwords will be announced twice per hour via Zoom poll. So write down these passwords and enter them into your digital evaluation form once the event is over. This evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your event reminder email. If you did not receive the email, please find the link in the evaluation form that I will post in the chat right now. Your first CLE password is international. Again, your first CLE password is international. You can message me privately if you have any questions.
Welcome, everyone, to the University of Pennsylvania Journal of International Law's annual symposium, International Perspectives on the Future of Incarceration. Thank you to each of you for joining us today, particularly those of you joining us from outside of the United States. Given the international focus of our journal, we feel very fortunate that the virtual nature of this event allows us to include individuals from around the globe. Before we get started, I want to express my gratitude to our symposium editors who have worked so hard to make this event possible. Francesca Burgini and Alex Eaton, this symposium would not be possible without all of your hard work. Thank you. Our symposium today addresses incarceration, specifically the future of incarceration. The current state of the carceral system is untenable, and something has to be done about it. Many systems of so-called justice throughout the world incarcerate an inordinate number of racial minority individuals relative to their respective populations. These communities are already subject to racism, discrimination, prejudice, and violence outside of prison systems, and incarcerating large numbers of their community members only exacerbates those struggles. Prison populations are also particularly vulnerable to the current COVID-19 pandemic. It is wreaking disproportionate havoc again on impoverished and minority communities, and those effects, when poorly managed, are only amplified among prison populations that exist in confined, often unsanitary spaces. In planning this symposium, we wanted to make a meaningful contribution to improving the world that we all share. We realize that the problems we are addressing can't be solved by one person or one symposium or even one nation. But in order to try, we have gathered a wonderful group of individuals from around the world to speak to us today on the current and future state of incarceration. They are leaders in their respective fields, and we are so fortunate that they have taken the time to speak to us today. Each presentation and panel will be followed by a question and answer segment. During the presentation and panels, please feel free to submit any questions you have using the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar. Allow me to begin by introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Alexander McLean. Founder and Director General of Justice Defenders, Mr. McLean and his organization work to train paralegals and lawyers within defenseless communities to provide legal services for themselves and others. Welcome, Mr. McLean.
Thank you, Hayden, for your kind introduction. Good day, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to reflect on the lessons that I've learned over my adult lifetime spent working in prisons around Africa, and as I've founded and led Justice Defenders. I believe that we're called to solidarity, to coming together to learn lessons, to collaborate across adversarial justice systems now more than ever before. Until I was 8 years old, I hadn't traveled outside of Europe. My life changed when my mum got a job with United Airlines. It opened up a world of possibilities. For next to nothing, we could fly all over the globe, usually in business or first class. I love the excitement of being at the airport, waiting to see whether there'd be spare seats on the plane for us. I got used to being served Dover sole and filet mignon. Not my favorite then as a little boy, but I enjoy them now. The ice cream sundaes with hot fudge sauce were the best. Our first trip in the early 1990s was to New York just before Christmas. We woke up in the middle of the night, jet lagged, and ended up at Denny's, where we ate pancakes by the stack. We visited FAO Schwartz, the city's oldest toy shop, where I marveled at the great quantity and variety of toys. On our final evening, before heading to the airport for our flight home, we went for a last walk through the city. It was New York as you imagine it should be at Christmas. The air was filled with snow, and people were moving around busily, preparing for the approaching holiday. The image was jarred when we came across an old black man shaking a tin of pencils, which he was selling. He wore a sign that said, "God is good, but I am blind." I couldn't get that man out of my mind as we flew home. To my 8-year-old self, his life looked hard beyond measure. The possibilities that existed to me, to travel between continents, to eat what I liked, to be home with my family, didn't seem to exist for him. And yet, his sign suggested he had something beyond self-pity, suggested he had hope. I think it was seeing this man which first triggered a sense within me that there might be strength and resilience and hope in unexpected people which could shape and form me. It's something I experience each day now as I lead justice defenders. In America, I found people of color woven into the public narrative in a way that I hadn't experienced at home. I learned about people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman, people who had resisted violent oppression with nonviolence, grace, and dignity. In America, there were Black role models, which were missing from my classrooms, either as my teachers or in my textbooks. My last visit to the United States pre-COVID started in Nashville. My family and I arrived there on the 15th of August, 2019, the same evening that Stephen West was executed in the electric chair at Riverbend Prison in the city. It was the United States that also first taught me about crime and punishment. American justice has shaped my thinking and outlook. In this talk, I'll be playing back some of my reflections, comparing the lessons I've learned about justice firsthand, my experience visiting about 130 prisons in 19 or so countries around the world, to what I learned about justice in the United States from my reading and research. At the age of 8 or 9, around the time my mum started working for United, I was at my local library with my dad, and I was struck by a photograph on the cover of a book. It featured a black man in a black and white striped prison uniform, seated in the electric chair, while besuited white men were tying wide leather straps all over his body. The expression on his face was one of total defeat, as if life had left his body before he had died. Later, I read about George Stinney. At 14, he was convicted of murdering 2 white girls based simply on a confession given to a sheriff who'd offered him ice cream and a chance to go home if he did confess. George was too small to fit in the electric chair and had to sit on a Bible in order for his head to reach the electrode. I learned about Willie Francis, whose electrocution at 17 was unsuccessful, with him shouting, "Shut it off, God damn it." After an appeal to the Supreme Court, he was electrocuted again, successfully, a year later. One thing that the man in the chair and George in his police mugshot had in common was a look of defeat. There was no sparkle in their eyes, rather a dull blankness. It was as if they were already dead. This is the effect that law can have. It can drive the lifeblood, the joy, the hope of a future from us and leave us feeling broken. As an adult, I've come to recognize that look on the faces of countless prisoners around Africa and beyond. And I've had my own heart broken by the realization that it doesn't have to be that way, that another way is possible. And indeed, I think many of the people who are here today are working to see that another way comes to pass. I'm glad to be with you, regardless of what you've done, what others have done to you. I'm privileged to have founded and to direct the African Prisons Project, which has now become Justice Defenders. We're a bunch of broken and beautiful people working out what it means to put the power of the law into the hands of the poor. When I was 18, death row inmates in Uganda nicknamed me a prisoner by choice. But since the age of 21, I've been a magistrate, a minor judge sitting in the UK, and sent people to prison myself. With Justice Defenders, we're building a movement of prisoners, prison officers, lawyers, and allies who move to the margins of society, to the places that others don't want to go, looking to bring justice and dignity and hope. Having had my heart stirred by injustice and really taking a joy in words, from a young age, I'd wanted to become a barrister, the term used in the United Kingdom for an advocate who presents cases in court. No one in my family had been a lawyer. My dad came to the UK from Jamaica in 1960, responding to the mother country's post-war call for labour. We didn't have very much money when I was growing up, but the British government used to pay for poor but bright children to go to expensive private schools. I got one of these assisted places. My dream had been to go to Oxford to study geography before going on to study law. Despite getting one of the 10 highest marks in the UK in my geography exams, Oxford said I couldn't think laterally and rejected me. This led to me taking an unexpected year out at the age of 18 to volunteer at a hospice in Uganda. I ended up spending time at a massive national hospital where patients were dying of AIDS and tuberculosis in the hallways, having been abandoned by their families. The first man that I cared for was lying on the floor of a ward by the toilet, naked. I asked a nurse what happened to this guy. She said the police found him unconscious in a market. We think he's in a diabetic coma. We don't know his name or if he has any relatives. Because he doesn't have money, he doesn't get treatment. We're waiting for him to die. It struck me to see this man lying naked and comatose. I went back the next day with the help of a nurse, bought soap and a towel and washed him and tried to advocate for him that although he didn't have money, the doctors might treat him. For a number of days, I tried to wash him and take care of him until one morning I arrived and he had died the night before. He was lying dead and naked on the floor of this ward. After a while, a porter came with a gurney and put this man's body on top of a dead woman and said they'd go in a mass grave together with everyone else who had no family to bury them. I called my mum that evening and I cried for that man. It was a turning point in my life because I realized that there are people in our world whose lives are judged to have no value. I spent 3 months on that hospital ward, washing and feeding and advocating for abandoned people dying of AIDS and TB. It was there that I met prisoners for the first time. Usually they were teenage boys like me. Often they'd been in prison for having underage sex, which in Uganda has a maximum penalty of death. It was common that they had been in prison for years without trial. Some had been horribly tortured by the police. Often in the hospital, the doctors and nurses would refuse to treat them due to the fact that they were prisoners. I took care of these men and occasionally women alongside a group of volunteers who joined me, nursing students, medical students, security guards, gardeners. I realized that there could be joy and satisfaction and purpose in serving those that others had rejected. I also realized that I could learn a huge amount from the people that I was trying to help. I was moved by this experience of caring for prisoners. I thought, if this is how prisoners are treated in hospital, what's it like for them in prison? I managed to bulldoze my way into Uganda's maximum security prison. It was built in the 1920s when Uganda was a British colony. It was designed to hold 600 inmates. Now it holds almost 4,000. I came to learn that at that time, 2/3 of prisoners in Uganda hadn't had a trial. I realized they could be in prison for 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 years waiting for that trial. I visited death row. It was built to hold 50 condemned men. At the time of that visit, it held 500. And sentenced to death for crimes like treason, or cowardice or mutiny, as well as offences like murder or armed robbery. I heard of the story of Edward and Padgy. He'd been sentenced to death for murder. He spent 12 years on death row before it came to light that the person he was convicted of killing was still alive. It would take another 6 years before he would be released. I was told of another condemned prisoner who was there for stealing a mango from a neighbor's tree. He'd been sentenced to death for armed robbery because he'd used a knife to cut it off. I visited that prison hospital. As I went in, an 18-year-old boy died. The place stank, the windows were smashed. I was told it hadn't been refurbished since the 1950s. That boy's body was sewn up into a blanket. I was told he would go to a mass grave. My sense was, regardless of what those prisoners had or hadn't done, there should be a place in their prison where they could go for treatment which was hopeful and dignified. I worked with prisoners and prison officers to refurbish that prison hospital, hoping to create a sense of value for the prisoners who were treated there and for the staff who were taking care of them. The death rate at that prison dropped after that refurbishment, and it reminded me that when we invest in our prisons, when we invest resources in creating environments which are dignified, well-resourced, hopeful, it changes the way that everyone in them feels about the environment, and it can powerfully motivate the staff working there. I came to see that around Africa, there were very many NGOs doing important work, well-meaning work, but it seemed there were very few working in prisons. And yet, it seemed that you would find the most vulnerable people in society in prison. Over the years, I spent time in prisons all around Africa. I met children of 4 or 5 years old in prison alongside their mothers. Sometimes their mothers are there because they've had a child who's become sick. The child was taken to hospital. The hospital had no treatment. The child died, and then the mother's imprisoned with the rest of her children for child neglect. I met those in prison for attempting suicide. I've met those who've had their fingernails pulled out by the police or been raped in the police station. I visited prisons which are standing room only, and visited prisons where women have given birth to babies who died in overcrowded cells for lack of access to basic medical facilities. I visited Juba Women's Prison in South Sudan. As the gate to the prison was opened, I saw a woman with chains on her arms and legs. I asked the officer escorting me, why is she chained up? The officer said, we chain up our lunatics, which was about 1/3 of the prisoners there for being mentally ill, and also those who are going to be executed. Although South Sudan was a newly formed country, it still had the death penalty, hanging. I said, what's going to happen to this woman here? I was told by the officer that she had been sentenced to death. The officer said she hadn't done anything wrong, but her husband had been accused of a capital crime. But the police couldn't find him. So the wife was arrested and tried and sentenced to die in his place. I was told by another officer of a 3-year-old child swimming in a river with a 5-year-old friend. The 3-year-old had drowned, and the 5-year-old was sentenced to death for murder. After that first project, refurbishing the hospital and the prison in Uganda, I returned to the UK to begin studying law at university. But my heart was still in Africa, and I spent all my university holidays either in Uganda or Kenya or Sierra Leone, establishing prison libraries and clinics. As I spent time in prisons around Africa and elsewhere in the world, I saw remarkable similarities in the challenges that the criminal justice system was facing. I've seen that around the world, it tends to be the case that prisons don't have the resources that they need. Often prison officers aren't paid highly. Often prison officers aren't appreciated for the role that they play, serving some of the most vulnerable in our societies. Often those who end up in prison are those who don't have access to lawyers. Often they're those who don't have means to pay for their own counsel. Many prisons struggle to play a role in rehabilitating, to invest in education. At the age of 21, I established the African Prisons Project to respond to some of these challenges. Initially, our work was all around improving the welfare of prisoners, working to make prisons better through investing in infrastructure and through healthcare and education and rehabilitation projects. Now our focus is on providing quality legal services to the poorest people, going to the root of the problem rather than dealing with the fruit of it. We saw that it didn't make sense to try and make prison better for those who didn't need to be there, for those who wouldn't be there if they'd had access to quality legal services. Last February, the African Prisons Project became Justice Defenders. Our new name reflects our commitment to a world where every person who comes into conflict with the criminal law has a chance to tell their side of the story before being convicted or punished for an offense. It reflects a belief that justice is a basic human right, that none of us gains from a world where innocent people are imprisoned, or one where guilty people are not given a chance to defend themselves effectively before conviction, and to have an opportunity to rehabilitate included in their punishment. It reflects our belief that the lessons that we've learned in Uganda and Kenya are relevant far beyond Africa, including in the United Kingdom and the United States. I began 2020 living in rural Kenya. My family and I regularly spent time in prison and with people from prison. My eldest son first visited death row when he was 5 months old. Proximity is core to Justice Defenders' identity, as we recognize that there's much that can only be seen with eyes that have cried. In March of last year, after traveling overseas, I found myself locked out of Kenya due to COVID restrictions and separated from my family. Since then, we've lived in 4 different borrowed homes around the UK and had a baby, Elliot, who's now 6 months and brings us great joy. Again and again, over the past 15 years, we've been invited and challenged to reimagine ourselves as an organization, never more so than during this COVID pandemic. From March of last year, the doors to the prisons that we work in were closed to us, as well as to other organizations and prisoners' families. We realized that in a pandemic, few communities are more exposed than prisons. We needed to find new ways, new possibilities for delivering legal education and training and practice. Our values of bravery and solidarity and humility guided us as we explored ways of using technology to create proximity. Our COVID response included facilitating virtual court hearings for thousands of prisoners to keep the wheels of justice turning. We paid fines for 150 minor offenders, especially pregnant women and mothers with children who were in prison because they were too poor to pay fines themselves, for offences like illegal collection of firewood. And we provided materials to prisoners and prison officers to keep them healthy and safe in the pandemic. I wonder how the last year has been for you at the University of Pennsylvania and beyond, trying to study and work in the midst of a pandemic and a country which, from a distance at least, looks to be exploring issues of deep-seated division around matters of race, equality, and justice. As justice defenders, we're asking how technology might allow us to reach our target of helping 1 million clients in defenseless communities receive fair hearings when they come into conflict with the criminal law by 2030. In prisons, we train refugees, those from slums, sex workers and homeless people as paralegals. Now we ask, what might it look like to go upstream and train those in refugee camps and slums and brothels or homeless shelters in law, so they might prevent their community members from ending up in prison in the first place? We're now a community of more than 200 prisoner and prison staff paralegals in Uganda and Kenya. Some have received basic training in criminal law, while just under 40 have completed law degrees with the University of London by correspondence, following in Nelson Mandela's footsteps in studying with the University of London from prison. This short video clip tells you something of our graduate, Francis's story. Hayden, I don't have any volume from the video. I'm not sure if I'm the only one.
I apologize. Let me try now.
Thank you.
I heard that University of London, they wanted to recruit prisoners to study for law. I thought, well, this is the golden opportunity to try and assist people, those who are undergoing the same predicament that I went through, unfair trials and all that. And then I chose to study law. The law degree with the University of London takes 3 years, but it took me 4 years, and it was not easy. I did not have a tutor. I did not have access to internet, and it is a course that's supposed to be online, but I made it. And the rest of the team, we made it. I graduated with a degree in law while in prison. When I was offered this chance to study law with the University of London, then I told God, well, this is the chance to prove to the world that the best can be achieved from maybe the seemingly worst or impossible.
Thank you, Hayden. The University of London was the first in the UK to admit women and non-Christians. And in addition to Nelson Mandela, it has 83 other Nobel Prize winners. Justice Defenders currently has 30 undergraduates working towards their law degrees from prison. Prisoners and prison officers studying law together in class side by side. In some cases, prisoners who've completed their degrees will teach prison officers who are in the midst of them. When asked, why do you train people in prison in law rather than simply working to give them more access to lawyers, we recall Oscar Romero's words, that there are many things that can only be seen with eyes that have cried. Prisoners and prison officers have a unique perspective on the law. They see how it plays out in the lives of some of our most vulnerable people. Last year, we saw approximately 5,000 people released from prison in Uganda and Kenya by courts, having received paralegal services from members of our community. Our first graduate, Moses, has gone from being a prisoner to being a prosecutor in the Ugandan army. The Ugandan army doesn't have any defense advocates, but we believe that someone who's been wrongly prosecuted has a degree of empathy and understanding which may be unrivaled. In both Uganda and Kenya, our students have been involved from prison and death row in Supreme Court cases which have resulted in the abolition of the mandatory death sentence. A judge now never has to give the death penalty in those countries. This is a photograph of Moses, our first graduate, at the maximum security prison where he was imprisoned for 5 years before having his conviction overturned and going on to become a prosecutor. We're a community of people who have stolen. Some have raped, some have killed, some have tortured, some have been tortured, some have been innocently imprisoned or sentenced to death. We believe that we can each play a role in making and shaping and implementing the law, because the law affects us all, from before we're born until after we die. We're a community of reconciliation, hated by many and expected to hate each other. Instead, we try to grow in love for one another and those we serve. We're inspired by the example of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, who responded to oppression and brutality with grace, dignity, non-violence, and wisdom. We delight in finding common cause. We're proud of the prison officers amongst us who go to court on behalf of prisoners who don't have lawyers to win them their freedom. We work hand in hand with the judiciary and prosecutors. We're pleased to invite these people into prisons with us, other than in COVID when it's not been possible, to share meals, to discuss the challenges facing the community with our paralegals. As we study and practice law together, we hope to grow in love for each other and those we serve. We're proud to showcase radical aspiration and Black excellence. Some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in some of the world's poorest countries, showing that they have brains that can move mountains. Each year, a number of our students achieve first-class marks, the highest that the University of London awards. Last year, we saw an average of 400 people each month released from prison having accessed legal support from our prison legal offices. We ask, where next? Where might this approach of training those with lived experience of conflict with the law have the greatest impact beyond the communities that we're presently part of? We found that there are justice defenders in many unlikely places. We reject the idea that prisons must be filled with poor people, and also that poor people are unable to understand the law, as one of our prospective funders said to us. The same funder asked, what's the point of doing this work to get people out of prison, even if they don't need to be there, if they don't have jobs to do when they leave, or if they're not in a position to contribute to the community economically? I've reflected on my experience with my community in Uganda, Kenya. Soon we'll be working in the Gambia. We asked what it looks like to work in countries beyond Africa, perhaps including the UK and the US. However, as law students and law teachers and lawyers, there are opportunities for all of us to use the law as an instrument of hope, an instrument of freedom from oppression and liberation anywhere in the world. I know that we have those from around the world. Many of you are American. Those who are, be mindful that when you speak, the world listens. The American embassies in Uganda and Kenya have in recent years been pushing plea bargaining as a means of reducing the huge backlog of people awaiting trial. I understand that in the US, almost all criminal cases are resolved in this way. But in countries where the vast majority of prisoners never meet a lawyer and spend years on remand, I think there's a real risk that out of desperation and a sense of being defeated by the law, as I saw in the eyes of those African Americans who were to be executed, that the innocent would rather take a conviction than wait indefinitely for trial. When we see injustice and inequality, of which there's an abundance around the world, we can and should become angry. But what do we do with that anger? It can consume us, burn out, or become apathy. What does it look like for us to move from anger, from having our hearts stirred, to action? My hope for 2021 is that we will channel the emotion of the past year into action for social good. There are 3 areas where I think there are particular opportunities for us to make impact. The first is when it comes to the death penalty. I was moved to read of the executions carried out in the United States during the recent Christmas and New Year period. A good friend of mine was involved in working on one of those cases and was deeply traumatized by it. I spent time with people on death row in many countries, and I've become friends with condemned men and women, and I've become friends with executioners. I'm not going to comment now on the morality of killing to show that killing is wrong, or that the presence of the death penalty can actually contribute to higher murder rates, nor the number of innocent people sentenced to death in the US or overseas, nor the cost of administering capital punishment. These arguments are well documented. I believe there are opportunities now for us to engage in renewed public discourse about the death penalty and whether it has a role in our societies, and to turn the spotlight on the administration of it and the injustices around it. My second hope for 2021 is that we might live in greater proximity to each other, especially to those whose lives look different from ours. Perhaps in 2021, if it's not your experience already, you'll consider new ways you might get proximate to those from different backgrounds to you. Ways in which they might shape you and be your teachers. Ways in which those from different backgrounds might educate you as you look to share the benefits of the education you've received with the world. Finally, my hope for 2021 is that as lawyers, we might listen more. We're used to talking. We're often articulate. We feel we have something of value to say. Especially for those of us who have an interest in human rights and immigration law and crime, we might feel that we make unheard voices heard. The reasons those voices may typically not be heard is that we can fail as societies to listen. What will it look like for us to listen more? If, like me, you come from a family that relied on welfare and a privileged legal education was beyond your parents' dreams for themselves, I want to offer you special encouragement. Perhaps more than any other profession, the law judges our success by the wealth of our clients, the hourly rate we charge. But for me, the legacy we will leave goes far beyond the wealth we can accumulate. There's remarkable transformative potential for our lives when we encounter the defenseless, as we work to support them in accessing justice. And perhaps we might get transformed by their boldness, courage, resilience, and compassion in return. I don't know if you've taken time to research who you come from. I'm the descendant of slaves and slave owners. I come from those who've committed great crimes and those who've suffered as a result of them. As we work in adversarial justice systems, I believe that we have the opportunity to make bridges of our lives between the rich and poor, those with power and those without it, those who are in prison and those who are free, those who are Black and those who are white. I believe there's a joy that comes with being that bridge. Whilst we have the extraordinary privilege of saying that the power of the law is in our hands, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to everyone. Everyone should have access to that power. you have an opportunity to help make that happen. If you have an inkling that you might have a role to play with your life in using the law as a tool for liberation and transformation, I urge you to take steps now. When the circumstances with this pandemic permit, have adventures, volunteer with organizations that share your values. Even though you may be young or inexperienced, I know firsthand that youthful conviction and naivety can be a source of change and hope in unlikely places, even if others write us off for our youth, our lack of resources, or the color of our skin. Oscar Wilde said of prisons, "The most terrible thing about prison is not that it breaks one's heart. Our hearts are made to be broken, but rather it turns one's heart to stone." As you go through life and you encounter challenges, failure, disappointment, or hurt, may you live with soft hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful presentation. I think I speak for everyone in attendance that I've been incredibly impacted by hearing you speak. So now we'll move into our Q&A portion of this keynote address. If there's anybody out there right now who still has questions and hasn't submitted them, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I do have a few for you that came in during the presentation, if it's all right for me to start with those.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So one of our audience members wants to ask more about the opposition that you faced in starting your organization and doing this work. You spoke a little bit about the struggles you overcame in getting an education, but did you face any opposition in terms of this particular path, this particular type of organization, this work in general? How did you handle that, if you did?
I think that there have been many challenges. I guess perhaps the most obvious one was that of finding funding for criminal justice work around the world. Is incredibly under-resourced. Many philanthropists don't prioritize it, or those that do prioritize it in the United States or the United Kingdom, saying, actually, we have enough problems close to home. Why should we be concerned about what's going on thousands of miles away from us? Why should we be concerned about what's happening to those who've been accused of serious crimes? Raising money has been a challenge, especially as someone who started out without any connections or without parents who could open doors in that regard. It's been a real journey to understand how to share this story in a way that broadly resonates. I think the secret to it is the fact that fundamentally, I believe that as human beings, we're united by an understanding that we can thrive when we live in societies which are fair, where we're equally protected by and accountable to the law. I think there's been resistance from the legal fraternity in the places we work. Sometimes the idea of prisoners and the prison officers studying for legal qualifications and applying the law in their communities can be seen as bringing the legal profession down in some way. We work really hard to build those bridges, to invite academics and legal practitioners into prison to spend time with us. So we're not looking to take work away from you, but rather to serve those who don't have access to lawyers. And we're a community that's committed, that works hard. Our students who are studying law in prison often study through the night as it's the quietest time in prison. We're really proud of the relationships we've built with law firms and universities and other legal partners in the countries that we work in. Saying, let us collaborate together. Let's find common cause so that we can work towards having more just communities. And then there's been perhaps the inevitable tension of trying to bring together those from very different backgrounds. Whether that's prisoners with prison officers, those from different countries, having conversations between prosecutors and those involved in defense. Very often, I think, there's a risk that we can work in silos in criminal justice systems. So rather than saying, what does it look like to focus on our common humanity? What does it look like to focus on our common values? What does it look like to be educated by each other and to realize that the one on death row can have knowledge, experience, wisdom to share with the rest of us, which can be transformative. And so we've been learning lessons gradually about the importance of listening, the importance of taking time to work through relationship when working in criminal justice systems, and about being slow to judge others, but to try and grow in empathy for them.
Thank you. Something you mentioned in your answer and that you mentioned throughout your presentation is this idea of proximity and how important that is. And we have a two-pronged question about that. The first is, could you tell us a little bit more about how you discovered and have fostered the importance of proximity, what forms that takes, as well as how you have managed that during COVID when you got essentially locked out of prisons and you couldn't have that physical proximity as a touch point for your work? What have you been doing during that time?
Again, we've learned over the years about the power of proximity. There's one way of bringing change in perhaps individuals or communities or nations, which is to stand on the edge. So you're doing this wrong. It shouldn't be this way. You're breaking these international laws. You're compromising your values. Perhaps sometimes that's effective, but it can also be a way of alienating those that you want to influence. It seemed that when it comes to conversations around many justice issues, there's a risk that they can be detached from the people that they affect most, or that these conversations are taking place in air-conditioned hotel conference rooms rather than in courts or in prison. There was also a risk, I think there is a risk, that these conversations can take place without those in the front line, those who know what the situation feels like and sounds like, those who have those years of lived experience. I've been challenged most vividly about it in relation to the death penalty and hearing conversations around it, but thinking about how we rarely hear the voices of executioners or prison doctors or chaplains or wardens who are involved in administering the death penalty. And I spent some time doing research with them and hearing profound stories of how that work can often brutalize them, but we don't hear those voices. I guess I've also realized that if you're looking to bring lasting change in a community or system, you have to understand it first. And I saw that it was possible for me to come in as an outsider with colleagues who were outsiders and say, hey, do you want a library in your prison? Or we want to give you a better health facility. And that community would say, yes, please, perhaps out of desperation, or perhaps because we didn't give them a chance to say anything else. But actually, it's only through listening deeply to that community, what their priorities are, what matters most to them, that we could serve them effectively and that we could support change or development, which was long lasting. And we'd learn a lot in the process of doing so. I think about how in criminal justice systems, we can get I guess, stuck in a rut and stuck in seeing ourselves in a certain way. I think about one case where a judge that we work with came into the prisons, one of the prisons that we work in, to see our work. And as he entered it, he came across this woman with a newborn baby. He said, well, why are you here and who sent you here? She said, well, you sent me here not very long ago. And he recalled her to court and released her. It reminded me that in the courtroom, the distance between the dock and the bench might only be a matter of feet, but it can feel like miles. There's a risk that maybe we don't see each other's full humanity, but when we come together, when we share life, if we share a meal, we can see each other more fully. One of the gifts of COVID is that it's opened up possibilities for us to connect with those in the prisons we work in using the internet. You heard Francis saying in the video that he hadn't had access to the internet when he was studying for his law degree some time ago. But since COVID, began and the lockdowns began, the prison services in Uganda and Kenya we work with have allowed us to have incredible online internet access, not only to facilitate virtual courts, and last year more than 13,000 prisoners attended court online using equipment that we provided, but to train paralegals online. We trained more than 100 of them online last year. We provided University of London law classes online. We're just rolling out an online case management system, which is allowing us to oversee our more than 20 prison legal offices remotely and provide remote support to our paralegals in them. We're also coming together each month for a Founders Forum I lead, where those in prison and outside of it who are part of our organization can raise their concerns or challenges they're facing, or bring items for celebration. We have assemblies where we get together to look backwards and to look forward. So we're able to listen to each other, to learn together, to prepare for the future post-COVID, because technology is allowing us to have high-speed internet access to some of the most remote places you can imagine. And it's making us ask, well, where next? What other communities are there where we might find justice defenders, communities where we might provide legal education and training so that they can defend the defenseless amongst them?
Do you have an idea of where next? Do you have a plan for that, or any inkling of what your future looks like?
We're probably invited once or twice a week to go into a new country or a new community, where they're getting requests from refugee camps and organizations working with refugees, or those working with the homeless. And we see that homeless people are appearing in court too often, that they're vulnerable in the hands of criminal justice systems. Will you train them? When I was living in Kenya, one of the highlights of my time there was one Saturday evening a month spent with sex workers, with a church group I was part of, just having a meal with them and listening to them and learning from them. I realized that many of them had a lot of experience with the police and with courts. They were knowledgeable about the law, that they received very regular attention from the police. Often they had a strong sense of solidarity with each other. Often they had large families that they were supporting, and wondered what it would look like to give that community training in the law. We were delighted to be on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper in December. And since then, we've had requests from prisoners in 14 different American states asking us to train them in law. Some writing from death row, very moving letters. So it feels like there are many possibilities. Our work isn't unique. Our approach isn't rocket science. Basically, it's saying, what does it look like to trust those with lived experience of conflict with the law, to acquire legal knowledge and to share that with their peers? And what does it look like to bring together those from around criminal justice systems to study and to collaborate? I'm very excited to think about possibilities in the United States, for instance, for prisoners and prison officers to study together, and to invite judges to come into prisons to have discussions around law with them, and to invite prosecutors and police to be part of that and say, look, we want the same thing. Fundamentally, we want the same thing. We want to be part of communities where we feel protected, where we have due process, where there are opportunities for rehabilitation, and a fundamental part of our humanity, whether a judge or a prosecutor or a death row inmate, is that we go to bed at the end of the day feeling that our day has counted for something. So how do we recognize and celebrate that?
Thank you. We've had 2 questions come in from the audience while we've been speaking just now. So I want to wrap up with these last 2, and I'll start with what I think is going to be the shorter of the 2. In the countries where you work, do prisoners have access to personal protective gear, such as masks, right now during the COVID pandemic, or are there other measures that prisons are taking to protect them?
So in Uganda and Kenya, we've seen the prison service try to respond as thoughtfully as possible to the pandemic. And it started with locking the prison doors to reduce the number of people coming in and out of prison. We've seen the judiciary has been open to finding new ways of dealing with cases and using non-custodial cases in more circumstances than would typically be the case. The prison services we work with have definitely tried their best to provide things like masks or soap, although it's not always possible for them to provide some basic necessities, even outside of pandemics, let alone in the pandemic, when resources are stretched, when government resources are stretched much further than usual. We've provided our paralegals with sanitizer and soap and masks and other protective equipment as they continue to do their work of defending the defenseless. But the reality is, if you're in a prison cell, which is, say, 10 by 20 feet, and there are 40 or 50 people in it, you can't social distance. We know that communicable diseases are prevalent in the prisons that we work in, and things like tuberculosis or diarrhea-related diseases have been huge challenges outside of this pandemic, and the pandemic makes those existing problems worse, as well as COVID posing a whole new set of problems. So I think that this is an especially difficult time to be in prison. At the beginning of COVID, we did an empathy mapping exercise to try and listen deeply to what was needed from the communities we're part of. And many said, we're scared, we want to be protected. And so that's been an important focus for us. But I don't think that anything can take away the challenge and the fear that I think very many people are feeling in prison now. I don't know if there was a second part to that question.
No, that was very that was wonderful. Thank you. The second question that we had come in asks if you could tell us more about how you and your organization have interacted with prosecutorial organizations in countries you work in, and if the U.S. is any guide, prosecutors have immense power to shape the systems they work in, and if that is the reality in African nations as well, how do you approach that?
I think that prosecutors play a hugely important, really significant and powerful role around the world, making decisions about who's charged, about possible diversionary tactics to avoid engagement with the formal justice system, making decisions about when to proceed with a case or not. I think a challenge is if a defendant doesn't have a lawyer, even if the evidence against them is very poor, they don't know how to challenge that. And so we've seen that there's power in bringing together prosecutors that we can work with in the countries we work in, to have conversations around how you interact with unrepresented defendants, to have conversations around the use of alternatives to imprisonment. And when Britain was establishing criminal justice systems in Commonwealth countries like Uganda and Kenya, there was provision for fines and imprisonment and caning and the death penalty, but there weren't really alternatives. We've been excited to see a huge increase in the use of things like community service as an alternative to imprisonment, bringing together prosecutors to talk about the challenges that they face in doing their work. And if you're prosecuting someone who doesn't understand at all what's happening in court, how to engage with the system, what questions they can ask, the role that they're meant to play, it can be a source of deep frustration and disappointment. And so we bring prosecutors together to listen to those in prison, to listen to other actors in the justice system, and to be heard, knowing that very often prosecution services are really under-resourced. They're pulled in many directions. There's this tremendous pressure from government and from society to be seen to be dealing with crimes effectively, to have high conviction rates, but yet often a lack of understanding about the pressures that they're under, that the resources that they lack. And the work often isn't celebrated. And so we try to find small ways that we can recognize the work that's being done by those across justice systems, including prosecutors. For instance, in December of last year, having a carol service and featuring Supreme Court judges and death row inmates and prosecutors in that, and trying to in small ways, celebrate the contribution that each of us can make across the system.
That sounds amazing. Thank you. That was the last question we had, and I was going to, say a few words about how impactful your talk has been for me and for those in our audience, I'm sure. But instead of doing that, I would just like to direct everybody's attention to the chat in the Zoom webinar. If you haven't looked at it already, it looks like we have two people here, Gilbert and Mr. Okumu, who have been beneficiaries of your work. And I think that they can do a much better job speaking on your behalf and the impact that you've had than I have. Oh, I see that you can't see that in the chat. There are two people here in attendance that Mr. McLean has helped and justice defenders have helped. And it's just clear to all of us that you do amazing work. And I would like to thank you from our journal, from myself personally, for taking the time to speak with us today and share your cause.
Thank you, Hayden, and thanks to my colleagues for joining me here. I wonder if we've got a minute to hear from Gilbert or William.
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to read the comments they sent in the chat. Gilbert says, "Thanks, Alexander, for you have touched many lives in the defenseless community. I am one of the beneficiaries of your great work, currently pursuing a law degree from the University of London, a program I started while in prison. I salute you, sir." And Mr. Okumu says, "I am a beneficiary of Alexander McLean. He gave me life and hope while in prison."
Thanks, guys. Thank you for being here. I know it's late in Kenya. It's exciting to be on this journey together. So thank you. Thanks, Hayden.
Of course. Thank you again. Everybody, we will take a 15-minute break right now. If you could all please return at 2:20 for Professor Austin's introduction of our first panel, COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, Prison and Pandemic Management. That's 2:20 Eastern Standard Time, so 15 minutes from now for everybody. Thank you.
And if you are getting CLE credit for this panel, the second passcode is HOPE. Again, the second passcode is HOPE, and you will need 2 passcodes for this event to receive your 1 ethics credit for CLE. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the symposium. My name is Francesca Burgini, and I'm a symposium editor for the Journal of International Law. I would like to introduce Professor Regina Austin, who will be moderating the first panel discussion. Professor Austin is a William A. Schneider Professor of Law right here at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School. In addition to using ethnographies and documentaries to illustrate cultural context in her torts class, Professor Austin has also worked with the Defender Association of Philadelphia and Lifers, Inc., an organization in the Philadelphia area that helps promote parole opportunities to those serving life sentences. Professor Austin is going to give a short introduction on the topic of COVID-19's impact on the criminal justice and prison systems. And the panel discussion will begin immediately following that at 2:30, although I believe we have a CLE announcement before that.
Thank you. The CLE passcode for this event, passcode number 1, is future. Again, future. I will be putting the second passcode for this event in the chat, and then the third passcode will be at the end of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Austin, for being here.
Okay. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this symposium. The topic is extremely important and extremely timely. We're going to embark on a comparative exploration of the impact of COVID-19 on criminal justice systems. So I thought I would add something to begin with on what's happening, or what seems to be happening, in the American penal system. According to the Marshall Project, as of February 9th, 2021, 378,000 residents of prisons had tested positive in this country Approximately 2,400 of the persons who are residing in prisons have died. In terms of staff testing positive for COVID-19, 102,000 prison staffers have tested positive, and 181 have died. What lies beneath these numbers? How is COVID affecting persons incarcerated in American prisons? I heard the keynote speaker talk about his experience with prisons in Africa and Great Britain. I'm not so sure that the experience in American prisons is all that different. I started working with prisoners, particularly lifers, in conjunction with a project that the Documentaries and the Law program undertook to make a video on behalf of Lifers, Inc., which is an organization which is based at SCI Phoenix, which is not far from Philadelphia. The project involved the commutation of sentences of life without the possibility of parole. In Pennsylvania, if you're sentenced to life, it's without the possibility of parole. And so we made a collaborative effort in producing this documentary. And as a result, I established relationships with lifers and their political and social and cultural agenda. And I have continued to maintain contact with the persons I worked with during this project. One of them wrote me the following message, and I thought it would be important to have some words directly from impacted people. I must have asked him about the conditions that he was experiencing, and this is what he wrote in October of 2020. I suppose that the difference with the quarantine this time around is that a larger number of COVID cases are documented, and that after coming off 5 months of quarantine since March 29, 2020, we were hopeful that things would get back to normal. However, realistically, we anticipated there would be a second outbreak because of the behaviors we observed with guards and staff members alike, not social distancing and not keeping on their masks. Hearing some of them describe that they hadn't had taste or smell for weeks, and how they believed that other guards and staff members have the virus or have been exposed to the virus. The impact is devastating to many of the prisoners because we are not getting proper cleaning supplies, no hand sanitizer solution, and long periods of double celling in these small spaces with no fresh air, no windows in the cell to open, showers every other day, TB sticks, diabetic sticks, blood withdrawal, temperature reading, and feeding all through the cell door wicket. At the same time, all kinds of chemical and disinfectants being sprayed on the cell door and left to air dry within minutes. Within minutes after spraying, they come around and sit your raw fruits, apples, bananas, etc., and food on the door wicket. It's difficult to read or study with a cellmate having to constantly use the bathroom, coughing, sneezing, and exercising in the cell. Two people can't sit on the floor at the same time without constant bumping into each other. Sitting, lying in bed for hours, legs and arms numb, back and side sore. Cell light continuously popping off every 2 hours. The first quarantine, we had free cable, where everyone was able to keep informed of the administration's endeavors to keep them safe and to watch organizations' programs. Nothing this time. Can't get hot water for commissary items. It's chaos, frustrating, and abating. We need fresh air. I hope this answers your question. In a subsequent email, he wrote, "The prison is on quarantine lockdown." This is in December of 2020. On DPAD, we just got let out for use of kiosks and telephone only. This is the first time out of cell in a week. We haven't had a shower in 4 days, which seems to defy any logic or recommendations of the CDC. You have 2 grown men living in a bathroom-sized cell with 1 stainless steel toilet sink mounted to the wall and that spurts fountain measures of barely warm water for maybe 3 seconds at a time once the water button is pushed. The water smells often of sewage, urine, and human feces. The cells are muggy because of poor ventilation or airflow. And so-called air circulation vent filters are unsanitary. Droplets of particles of all sorts are being sucked into the ceiling and released back down for inhalation because the vent filters are saturated with dirt particles. No windows, no fresh air. We aren't allowed any yard time. We receive 1 small cup, 4 ounces, of heavily diluted disinfectant for cleaning the toilet and sink. Can you imagine 2 grown men or women trying to wash in a drinking water fountain after taking dumps and for countless days or weeks at a time? The same toilet stink they have to drink from, no scrubbing supplies or potent cleaning solutions to eliminate germs or potential bacterial life. That's the reality of the conditions we're living in. As new cases of COVID-19 mysteriously find their way amongst prisoners who notably haven't left the prison in years or even decades, the only way prisoners are going to be safe for anyone is that there have to be a release mechanism for the reduction of population. Sorry. Of prisoners who are not a public safety threat, including life sentence prisoners. They are a stable population of 5,000 plus prisoners. I am not sure when the next time I can email, but I will keep in touch. Blessings and peace. This was a message from someone who was incarcerated in SCI Phoenix. If you take what this person has said and expanded throughout Phoenix and throughout the system in Pennsylvania and then throughout the country, there are at least 3 questions that I hope we will be able to discuss today. One is, what are the mechanisms for reducing prison population that can be utilized to increase the safety of those who remain? Commutations, compassionate release, and reprieve in Pennsylvania are politically fraught. What can we do about the politics? Number 2, to what extent should staff be subject to mask requirements, quarantines, and vaccinations? What about the politics of those mitigation measures? And then 3, should residents of prisons and jails be given priority with regard to access to PPE and to vaccines? What is the obligation of the state to keep people in prisons safe relative to its obligations to others? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we're going to be addressing today, and I look forward to the discussion. So now Francesca will introduce the rest of our panelists.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Austin. That was very vivid and welcome introduction. And so now I'd like to welcome our 3 panelists and briefly introduce them. Claudia Mazzucato is a professor of criminal law at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan, Italy. She is an advocate for criminal justice reform, in particular, the model of restorative justice. She is an international associate at the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking at the University of Minnesota and is on the editorial board of the International Journal of Restorative Justice. Her recent publications include an article about COVID victims in Italy. Dr. Frieder Dunkel is Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Criminology at Greifswald Universität in Greifswald, Germany. Since 2002, he conducted several international comparative projects on men's prisons in the states of the Baltic Sea, on women's imprisonment in Europe, and on long-term imprisonment in 10 different European states. He recently published an article on the impact of COVID-19 on prisons and penal policy in Germany. Mark Wojcik is professor of law at the University of Illinois at Chicago John Marshall Law School, where this semester he is teaching international law and criminal law. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland and the Facultad Libre de Derecho de Monterrey in Mexico. His recent publications include a book chapter and an article on COVID and criminal justice. Thank you very much all for being here, and we look forward to a lovely discussion. And as a reminder to any attendees who wish to submit questions, please do so at the bottom of your screen through the Q&A function. Thank you.
I guess if everyone would unmute their, at least share their screens with us so we can see you. There you go. All right, Professor Dunkel, can we see you? You know the order in which you're supposed to go. Professor Muscato?
Okay.
You're first.
Okay, thank you very much. I indeed would like to thank the organizers for this invitation and to thank you all for your attention and consideration today. I look forward to discussing with you and hearing your comments and questions. I would like to briefly address two issues. One is related to prison and pandemic management, and I will just devote a few sketches to this subject. The second is related to the emergence in Italy and in other European Union countries during this pandemic of the so-called Covit victims and survivors and their pressing quest for truth and justice. And this second topic poses, in my view, important challenges for criminal justice. So first, prison and pandemic management. Since the pandemic outbreak, exactly a year ago, prison facilities in Italy have truly become an inferno, a nightmare. And this is due, on one hand, to a severe prison overcrowding that is not new in my country, and that Italy did not resolve regardless of the judgments, several judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Overcrowded prisons became places favorable to the spread of the virus. This in turn caused inmates to feel literally trapped, with increasing feelings of rage, anxiety, and fear for both themselves and their loved ones outside, given the alarming news daily released by the media. Revolts took place at the very beginning, even violent ones. Anxiety and fear are shared by prison staff too, and particularly by penitentiary police, who is compelled to share the inmates' environments more than any other prison staff. Since last year, therefore, Italian prisons are closed places like never before, and people are literally locked in. Now, maybe we can stay on the other. Francesca, can you turn? Yes, please. No one from outside is admitted. No face-to-face visits are possible. Little or no activities are carried out. Contacts among prisoners are extremely limited, since inmates are confined in the areas they usually use overnight. The government has progressively adopted special, temporary, compassionate measures to reduce the number of inmates and to expand alternatives to incarceration. But these measures had little impact and were poorly effective because of either political controversies and the condition of the inmates that do not allow them to have places to stay outside. Correction staff is in smart working, which is causing further delays in delivering the reports to the judiciary, which in turn reduce the accessibility of alternative measures. Hundreds of professors of criminal law and criminal procedure, and this is a slide, including myself, have joined a hunger strike last December to put pressure on the government, hoping for structural solution and urgent solution, but these are yet to come, and we hope in the new government. I come to the second topic. In March last year, the pandemic outbroke rapidly in Italy, while our healthcare system broke down as rapidly, especially in Lombardy, where I live, and particularly in the city of Bergamo, and the photos I show are from Bergamo, had an impressive number of people dying because of COVID. The dead were so many that the army, as you see, had to manage the corpses. The dead were cremated without the families being informed. These photos circulated all over Italy and outside. We can turn to the next slide. The next slide shows this interactive New York Times page, web page, offering a sort of memorial site for Bergamo's victims, who could not even have obituaries in the local newspapers because the dead were too many. What happened next is of extreme interest for a reflection on criminal justice, its objectives and effectiveness. In the aftermath of the peak of deaths, family members of Covit victims in Bergamo and Milano, and then all over Italy, gave birth to Victims Association claiming truth and justice. As you see, this is their association in Bergamo, the Committee of Victims. The accusation concerns recklessness and negligence in managing the pandemic, resulting in thousands of deaths for which sanitary staff, local and national institutions, and the national government are blamed, liable, and responsible. So criminal justice investigations began. Several criminal proceedings began too and are being carried out. Two main criminal proceedings are in place so far. They concern the absence of an up-to-date pandemic plan and the untimely establishment of a lockdown. All over Europe, we can turn to the next slide, and particularly in Spain and France, but also in Belgium and Portugal, similar quests for truth and justice are being carried out. COVID victims seek for the causes and responsibilities of the sanitary crisis in their country, asking for justice, truth, recognition, compensation, and/or punishment. They want to act to improve the prevention and management of sanitary crises and the care of patients to avoid the repetition of similar harmful situations in the future. So we can turn to the next slide. This is Spain. This is France again. Francesca, please. These are Victims Association again in France, asking for investigation and placing lawsuits. So COVID victims what a COVID victims are seeking is very similar to the expectations and needs that emerge in transitional justice context, as in the aftermath of intentional collective violence. Of course, this is not the case, but the expectations and needs are so similar. Truth, justice, protection, memory, guarantee of non-recurrence. And next slide, and I'm done. These immense needs and expectations will very likely be frustrated inside the classic criminal justice because of its traditional punitiveness. Criminal justice is an enemy of disclosure and truth. And punitiveness entails defensiveness. And this will not help these people learn what has happened, to know the truth. And this lack of disclosure and truth, next slide, will prevent the need of the guarantee of non-recurrence, which needs error to be disclosed and corrected in a foresightful management and resilience organization, resilient organization of the way we address the pandemic. I will stop here and possibly provide more details during the roundtable discussion. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to listening to your feedbacks.
Professor Wojcik.
I believe I'm speaking after Professor Dunkel.
Okay. Professor Dunkel, that wasn't the order that I was given, but Professor Dunkel, are you ready to go? That's all right. Can you unmute yourself first, Professor Dunkel?
Okay, now?
There you go. Yes.
Okay. Is it okay with you?
Yes, that's fine. Go ahead.
So I want to share also my screen with you. Oh, is it possible that I can give you my PowerPoint?
Can Professor Dunkel be made a co-host so he can share his screen?
Yes, yeah. He has permission to do so now.
Great. Thank you, Hayden.
Okay.
There you go.
Now you see it here. So my presentation is very long, and I have to show you all my slides I have, but I have done this presentation in order to give you the whole piece, to read it and maybe to ask later questions after this seminar. I'm talking about a project which we started in March last year. First in Germany, looking at the criminal justice system there and the impact of COVID-19 on the prison system. And in April, I started to internationalize this project by asking my international friends and networks around the world. So we are now having about 50 chapters, about 50 countries in the world, mainly in Europe, but also in the US and in Latin America, in Africa and Asia and New Zealand, Australia, and so on. So the aim of this project is not only to look at the impact on infections and deaths by prisoners and prison staff members, but also to try to find solutions for the criminal justice systems in the future, and maybe to rethink imprisonment from a kind of what we call a reductionist approach. That means we think that too many people are imprisoned and too many people are entering prisons. And this is just in the Corona time, one of the biggest problems, that the influx into prisons is so high, in particular because of the high number of short-term imprisonment, which is in my country, in Germany, the case with the so-called fine defaulters, those who have received a fine and cannot pay them or do not want to pay them, but mostly they cannot pay it. And then they go as a substitute sentence, they go to prison. And this is maybe for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or 2 months or so. And this creates a lot of problems. And our country with 16 federal states, each state has his own prison legislation, but we have one unique penal law and current procedural law. So we have 16 prison laws and on the basis of one penal code. And we are thinking then about how to reduce prison populations, how we succeeded apart from the pandemic. And therefore, I would like to show you just a picture. This is the prison populations in Europe before the pandemic. And you see that we have Europe is a kind of divided continent. In the eastern part of Europe, but also in Spain, France, and England and Wales, we have relatively high prison population rates. But we see before the pandemic already a quite interesting development on a decrease of imprisonment in many European countries, or at least stabilization, and a very few countries in Europe have an increasing prison population rate. So the story about Germany is we had before the pandemic a 21% decrease of the prison population due to introducing alternative sanctions, also a reduce in violent crime, and so on. There are several reasons for that. But during the pandemic, in the first in the months from March to June, we have a further reduction of about 13%. And this came because we have strongly reduced the number of fine defaulters. We stopped executing short-term prison sentences in general. Some federal states even prison sentences of up to 3 years. We stopped that in order to get the space for quarantine departments and so on, and to protect the inmates from infection. I have some interesting data also about here the Eastern European countries, and for our friends in the United States, you can see that Russia in the early 2000s had about the same prison population rate as the United States, with more than 700, and they have decreased now to less than of 50, more than 50%, and arriving to the more I would say the average of Europe, still the highest number in Europe, but in a strong decrease. Again, one could discuss that. I have quite a lot published about the reasons for these developments in Eastern Europe also. And in particular, the Baltic states are also interesting. Overcrowding in Europe, as you see here, was a particular problem in France, Italy, and some Turkey and some other countries, but not in Germany, for example. And so I have a whole section which I don't want to present now about Latin America, which is an outstanding continent with so many problems and an increase of prison populations and overcrowded populations, which can explain also how the pandemic could spread so much in these countries, because no distancing, they have large dormitories where people are crowded in one room, unbelievable situations, and no surprise that they have had riots in Venezuela and other countries. But this is not my main topic. There are a lot of statements in the early beginning of the pandemic by the Council of Europe, by UN, United Nations, asking for the member states to decrease prison populations by just using early release, immediate or early release of certain groups of offenders, and of also the short-term prisoners. I don't go to the details of that. Our initiative was, I have already talked about, started in the early 2000, March, April 2000. By the way, if you don't know what Greifswald is like, Greifswald is here on the screen in the northeast of Germany, the wonderful Baltic Sea coast. And it's a small city of 60,000 people, mainly university. And so we have I don't also tell much about the incarceration policy in Germany. Maybe only one thing. In Germany, we have a sentencing system in the adult criminal law that more than 80% of the sentenced people received fines, and about 6% prison, unconditional prison sentence. And this is why we have so many problems with fine defaulters, because about 10% or so of the fines are not paid, and therefore we have a secondary imprisonment of people who go there because they can't pay the fine. So we have decreased in all federal states, in particular with the pandemic in March, stopping short-term imprisonment, executing short-term prison sentences. And you see here Hamburg, Berlin, and all these federal states with a decrease everywhere after the pandemic. So we had not real problems with overcrowding, but we have now much more space for isolating specific prisoners or infected people. But again, and this was mainly the result of reducing fine default imprisonment by more than 70%. I have now also prepared naturally a lot of data for other countries in our survey, but I cannot present that in these 15 minutes. I just have to look. Okay. I have still about 5 to 10 minutes, is it? Or 5? Yeah.
Do you want to take 5 minutes and then wrap up?
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay.
And the interesting, well, you all know about what happened, restrictions in the lockdown time by personal visits, and instead of that, somehow video visits and some compensatory measures in order to calm down the situation in prisons, which was somehow in some countries very tense. Our thought was about how the situation differs in the European different European countries. We have remarkable decreases in Bulgaria, France, Italy. In France, they just released 10,000 prisoners. It's amazing how they did it and how that was accepted also. In other countries, we had no effects. And this is a table, you can have a look later, which shows the developments of in the different European jurisdictions during the pandemic, done by Marcello Ebi and his collaborators in Lausanne. In data about infections, we have from Europris, an international platform, European platform, where we can see that there are countries without any infections in prisons, indeed, Cyprus or others, Finland, very few. In Germany, we had only 0.1% of prisoners showing infections, and no deaths. In the second wave of the pandemic, a little bit more, but since January this year, we have almost no infections in prisons in Germany anymore. And this is a quite good sign of a good management of the prison administrations, independent from the different federal states. My data about Austria, Belgium, Croatia, you can read that later if you are interested in, but you can also certainly read the book which we are preparing now. Okay, I just leave that. We have
Do you want to just leave it there, and we'll come back if we during the
very brief notion on that. During the pandemic, we have stopped all measures to prepare prisoners by early prison leaves, preparation for release, and all what is effective in resettlement of offenders, and which is described in this book, has been stopped. And so we have to think about how we can cope with such situations in the future, how we can re-establish rehabilitative measures in prisons which are necessary for a successful re-entry of prisoners. And we have, as Professor Austin, you have asked for the strategies. What kind of strategies do we need for reducing prison populations? One strategy is naturally the widening of the scope of community service, suspended sentences, probationary supervision, and replacing short-term imprisonment by alternatives on the sentencing stage, but also in the execution stage. But as in some countries, it's possible that the prison administration just brings the prisoners the last 6 months. Let's let them go to home detention, to house arrest or something like that. So that this is a question of executing. We have that used in Germany by prison leaves of up to 6 months in the last stage of the prison sentence. They can stay at home for 6 months and then are released ordinarily. And this helped a lot in the German situation, just to bring these people out of prison. I don't think that electronic monitoring would have a possibility or a proportionate reaction for these people. So, but this is another issue. So, okay, that's about some of these strategies. And if you look at the short-term imprisonment, you see that a lot of countries in Europe use short-term imprisonment still very widely, and this is the scope of political change we need to end these unuseful short-term imprisonments. So, okay, thank you for your patience, and I think we have time.
We will come back to you. You've given us some provocative subjects to talk about. Professor Wojcik.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Austin. Thank you to the organizers of the journal. And thank you for my fellow panelists. Mr. McLean, your work is very inspirational. At the end of our lives, we like to think, have I done something important? And you obviously have. With your life, with your work. We congratulate you and wish you success in all of your endeavors. And Professor Matsukato and Professor Dunkel, I'm honored to speak with both of you, and I look forward to future collaborations and exchanges. We're talking today about a common threat that presents common problems, hopefully in a search for common solutions. But we know that one size does not fit all, and that what's appropriate for one country might not even be feasible in another. We know that with the COVID pandemic, hearings around the world have been canceled, civil and criminal hearings, that bail proceedings have been disrupted, that there have been all kinds of problems, and some innovative solutions. Early release to reduce the populations in jails and prisons. We've seen examples of this from around the world in all of the presentations today. But as Professor Austin noted in her introductory comments, this is a very political question. We've seen innovations such as non-cash bail, including in my home state of Illinois, where legislation has just passed and is waiting the governor's signature. When you don't have to post a cash bail, you have a chance to lower the prison population. We have some innovative solutions, but still many problems. And many people are dying because we're not listening to the needs. Let me share a few preliminary observations about the pandemic and the criminal justice system. First, with the lockdown, because people were staying home, we saw in many categories, in many jurisdictions, an overall decrease in many of the different categories of crime. People were home, and there was less crime in many categories, with an exception of murder. People living together didn't have other outlets to relieve the stress, so we saw a rise in murder cases. We also saw an increase in domestic violence, not in the rates reported, but in the anecdotal reports of domestic violence. People were at home under stressful situations. Many people lost their jobs. This made the situation worse. But we didn't see increases in the reporting of domestic violence, perhaps because people were unable to call. They didn't have privacy to reach out when their abuser was home all day with them in close quarters. And for others, that they were afraid to go to a domestic abuse shelter for fear of catching COVID there. At the beginning of the pandemic, we also saw an increase in burglaries of restaurants and stores. When everything was ordered to be shut down, there was no guards there. There was no staff there. So people would break into restaurants and bars and just have a field day for a couple of days. They would just sit and eat all the food in the restaurant, drink all the alcohol in the bar, and see that at the beginning. Now that's stopped. We haven't seen that from the beginning, but at the beginning of it, March and April of last year, that was a thing happening. We've seen different kinds of new crimes emerge. We've seen in South Africa this week even fake negative test result certificates. So people can show fake COVID negative tests so that they can cross borders. We've seen in China fake vaccines. Little vials of saline water are being sold, and the people selling that have made more than $3 million in one report from China. We've seen all over the United States increase in identity theft for unemployment benefits and for the money made possible from the federal government to compensate for lost jobs. We've seen increases in wire fraud for contact tracing. Someone may call up and say, hey, we have a report of you being exposed to COVID. Please give me your social security number so that we can follow up on the tracing, and people give their private personal information to someone who is just faking the contact tracing. And another recent development is that we've seen an increase in carjackings. Carjacking, when you go up to the car with a weapon, force the person out of the car. We've seen an increase in that because people are used to seeing people with masks now. So it's not unusual to see a group of men standing around with masks on, and you don't have the same fear factor that you would have before, where you would be a little more suspicious or careful. We've seen all kinds of disruptions in the criminal justice system. Jury trials have stopped, bail hearings disrupted, forensic crime labs are closed, law libraries are closed. Notaries cannot notarize documents because they have to be in the presence of the person as they sign that. Now, there have been workarounds for that, such as you sign the document online and then you get the document transferred to the notary so they can notarize what they saw you do online as long as they're sure it's the same document. There have been some workarounds for that, but there's been other kinds of disruptions. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them we don't know what to think about. In the death penalty, for example, Purvis Payne in Tennessee was scheduled to be executed in Tennessee, and the governor of Tennessee has issued him a reprieve from the death penalty until April 9th because of COVID, because of challenges and problems in COVID. Where are we with prisons? We recognize that there's a public health danger to inmates, and Professor Austin shared with us the really staggering numbers of the number of inmates exposed and the number who have died. And this is in prisons, in jails, in other places of detention, and even immigrant detention. We know that prison guards are recognized as being people who need personal protective equipment and who need vaccines. But we know that the prisoners are there with them too, and that they have no option to socially distance or to get fresh air or to have any freedom, any relief from that. We know that they're denied personal protective equipment in some cases, or adequate personal protective equipment. This mask, for example, has a wire bit in here, which some guards say can be used as a weapon. So they can't have the metal part on the mask, and then it doesn't fit properly on your face. Maybe you have a cloth mask as well, but how often are those washed? How often are those cleaned for you? We have also now, thankfully, vaccines around the world. And we know that prison guards are being recognized as a priority category for vaccines, but not the prisoners themselves. I believe that they should be. But this has a number of conflicts as well, probably worthy of its own symposium on its own. How do you distribute the vaccine to prisoners? Do you make it mandatory for them? No, you don't, because we can't inject people with what we know as experimental vaccines without their consent, without their informed consent. And how do we get prisoners informed consent? Do we give them access to the medical testing data? Do we give them access to arguments against testing, against vaccines? How do we deal with this? It's an impossible situation that we need to think about to come up with some solutions. I believe that the government, if I come up with an overall rule, I remember back when I was doing a prison transfer case with two American women who were imprisoned in Peru. They had been drug smugglers and were in prison conditions that endangered their health and safety. We were working the case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to have them transferred back to the United States. When I was representing them and talking with their case about others, we knew that they weren't innocent. It wasn't about their innocence, but we came up with a theory of the case that I believe applies to everything now, is that the government cannot imprison you in conditions that endanger your health and safety. The government is going to lock you up. It has to do so in conditions that are safe for you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. Professor Austin, you're muted.
I was reading some of the questions. Before we get to the audience questions, I guess I should ask you first if you have any questions of your fellow panelists to give you an opportunity. If not, I have plenty of questions. My first question would be, we've talked about some negative things and we've talked about some positive things that have occurred in prisons because of COVID, or that were occurring before, as Professor Dunkel suggests, and that were speeded up or expanded because of COVID. I guess I want you to speculate as to whether or not these improvements, you might say, in the operation of incarceral institutions are likely to be continued, and what the politics of doing that might be in the countries that you have investigated. Anybody want to go first on that one? Should I should I take a volunteer, or should I find a volunteer? Professor Dunkel.
I think what we have learned is that the digitalization of the prisons is rather accelerated in these days. We have in some of our, in Germany, but also in other countries, we have these access to internet, video calls, and we have internet visits, communication with families. It's much better today, and this will probably be preserved after the pandemic. We have now starting, we have already some federal states who have mobile phones or telephones in the cells. So the prisoners in Germany are normally in one prisoner in one cell. So this is the standard from human rights point of view. We think that it should be, and so they have their own telephone device, and they can have daily calls to their families and talk to their children and so on. This will probably be expanded to all prisons in the near future. Some federal states have it already, and also all these digital forms, e-learning in prison, that will be increasing. Vocational, not vocational, school training programs and so on will be available for prisoners much easier than before. It's a difficult question to how to the access to the internet, but we must limit it naturally. We cannot open the whole internet to prisoners, which could be easily abused then for other purposes than for resettlement approaches. So yes, and even we have raised also the question, even what about the prison staff? Can home working or is that possible? Home office? Naturally, not for the prison guards, but for those doing administrative work. Yes, it could be to a certain extent. Not many of the prison staff members can be sent for home work or for home office work. So,
Can you
okay?
Can you explain why the society would be willing to accept such a change in the terms and conditions of imprisonment as have been implemented during the pandemic, after the pandemic is hopefully over? What is there that makes the society receptive to such loosening of restrictions?
My impression is that everybody in our society has experienced what deprivation of liberty under lockdown for even the free people means. And lockdown, in the lockdown, prisons have a double lockdown, if you want. They are always deprived of the possibilities to move around. And now everybody has experienced that in the weeks where we were not allowed to move away from our houses or so, or only certain hours, only for shopping. And this is a bit the same as house arrest or home detention. And so I think people have now a better understanding what it means, deprivation of liberty, and that a year in prison is an awful thing. It's just pain, is suffering for the people who are under these measures, under these. And so that is my hope, that people are more sensible about any form of deprivation of liberty, having experienced that. And I mean, in our continent, in Europe, particularly in Germany, the acceptance of human rights-based improvements of the prison system is widely enshrined in a cultural understanding of I mean, Italy is the same with this constitutional right of rehabilitation, and so this is not at the disposal of any legislator. This is a constitutional demand to have a rehabilitative prison system, and this has to be accepted. And for any offender, no matter what crime is behind it. I have maybe the others should also talk.
Professor Mazzucato, what is your response to the question of continuation of what you see positive about the response to COVID management and its continuation in the political climate?
I agree with what Professor Dunkel said, that also in Italy, we will keep using internet video calls, video conferences with family members after the pandemic is finally over. And this is very interesting because in Italian prison facilities, inmates cannot have phones, cell phones. Those who use computers have a special permission by the judiciary. And so this is a huge change, a positive one that will be carried on. But if I may, I am so impressed about how similar the situation is, also on the negative aspects of what you have described, Professor Osting, or what Professor Wojciech has described and Professor Dunkel throughout Europe. And this, to me, is an issue of why all over the world we have not been able to address the fact that prison life has become more and more restricted because of this pandemic, causing a huge suffering. I am more concerned about this reduction of the small liberties the people in jail have because of this pandemic than their exposure to the pandemic. In Italy, this was not too bad, but everyday life has become really like animals in a trap. This is how one prisoner described their situation, and they feel inside their cells all day long with no contacts, fearing for the family members outside. And this is creating rage. And I'm very concerned about what will happen next if this rage is not taken into account by the institutions.
Any response to that? Based on my experience, particularly with the lifers at the nearby correctional institution and others in the state, I would say there are two concerns. One is the enormous fear that people have. The fear because they do not have control over their well-being. They are not in control of their own safety. Prisons have become dumping grounds for people who need other kinds of services, particularly with regard to physical health and with regard to mental health. And so you have people being introduced in prisons who were not there before COVID, who maybe do not understand the culture, particularly the culture that lifers have established in many institutions. Lifers keep some institutions calm. We were talking about people who are mature. We were talking about people who are good at mentoring other people and bringing them along. The capacity of prisoners to engage in acts of agency has definitely been reduced, and that has made a difference. The fear that what small opportunity they might have had to be released from the prison by being agents in their own lives, being productive citizens in the community in which they find themselves, that chance is being jeopardized. In the facility that I'm familiar with, a man who had been in prison for 45 years, who was 69 years old, who had been voted affirmatively out of the border pardons for commutation. His commutation was sitting on the desk of the governor, and he died of COVID. The other 13 people who were on the governor's desk were almost immediately granted a commutation, because you can imagine what the response was among the activist community, not to mention the Philadelphia Inquirer. But he exemplifies, I think, the great fear. So you have a loss of agency and tremendous fear that the hope that had kept people going suddenly died. So when you're talking about truth and reconciliation, there is a concern with regard perhaps to truth and reconciliation within our penal institutions. What would you propose with regard to that? Clearly, there are things that have happened under COVID that we would like to see sustained. The question is, what more might be done? If you were in charge of the system, what would you propose? And if you were concerned about the mental state that comes from a lack of agency and perhaps the diminution of, if not the total destruction of the hope that someday one would be free, what would you propose as a solution to that?
Are you asking me or all of us?
I'll start with you.
Okay. I'll be quick so I can leave the floor to the others. Well, I indeed advocate a sort of parajudicial truth commission to learn from this experience and to set in place a more resilient organization to this situation, to like situations. And actually your input to include prisoners and prison staff in this work is of extreme, of utmost interest, because they are the only, unfortunately, real expert of this lack of agency. Lack of agency that in some cases is not even the possibility to have a book from the prison library, because they cannot move inside the prison. And I would really think that basically the whole world, but definitely Italy, we are undergoing a collective trauma. And as in transitional justice settings, we need to have a conversation with our past, or recent past, with what has happened to us at all levels of society, in order to promote the guarantee of no recurrence of situations like this. But thank you so much for this input. I think it will be so important to include these citizens, these members of the community who are deprived of everything now. And it is so painful and such a pity, for reasons that have nothing to do with security, with justice, but because of the situation we are not managing, dealing with properly. And this, I think, it's a huge question for each one of us.
One of the issues that was raised in the United States with regard to access to the vaccine was that there were people on the outside, in the outside world, who had not violated the law and who had lived peaceful and law-abiding lives, and that they should be given priority over people who find themselves in prison, particularly people who are serving sentences of life without the possibility of parole, which is in essence a death sentence. When it comes to scarce resources, and it comes to the allocation of scarce resources, what is true in the societies from which you come with regard to the response to that claim, that people who are incarcerated ought to be at the back of the line, if somebody has to be at the back of the line, knowing that vaccines are scarce, PPE is scarce. There are other scarcities that somehow it ought to make a difference because they are incarcerated. Professor Dunkel? Professor Wojcik?
Yeah. Do you want or? Okay. I think we have to look at the question of who gets first the vaccination and in which order we organize that. Our approach, at least in Germany, is that we want to prevent deaths of the most vulnerable groups. So we have started with those over 80 in residential care and so on. Then we go down to the over 70-year-olds, and also to people who have prior health problems, serious health problems, who are the vulnerable groups. And the third group will be also including policemen, prison guards, and also prisoners. And I think we cannot make a differentiation between prison staff members and prisoners because they are the same vulnerable groups. They cannot avoid to meet each other on a very close situation. So, that has nothing to do with that these are criminals and these are the good people outside who don't get yet the vaccine. Is just a question of the order of the most endangered people, and we start with the most endangered people. These are the very old people. This is a decision we have made in our country. I think in other European countries it's similar. But naturally, you could also say we start with the very young people and the olders die anyway. So, but this is a kind of cynical approach, which I would not support too much. And therefore, I'm quite happy that we have now we have a very low vaccination situation at the moment, but in March, April, we will advance quite considerably, I hope, and then the situation will change. Also, the death rate will decrease because the elderly are then get this vaccination. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to principle guided. We have to think principle guided from kind of also human rights perspective, I would say. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
To deny the vaccine or personal protective equipment to prisoners is to deny their humanity, and we need an approach like they have in Germany, where the prisoners are in the same category as the guards, not that they're separate or differently situated. They have no ability to avoid this. They have no ability to escape. We cannot just say, oh, you stole a car, so now you have a death sentence. This is fundamentally wrong. We need to treat them with the dignity and respect that Mr. McLean demonstrated in his first opening keynote address about the dignity of each individual prisoner. We know that in the court system, they're going to continue the innovations in bond hearings, appearances, bail hearings, that all of these will be done more quickly, perhaps more efficiently with Zoom and with other programs, that lawyers have a chance to confer with clients in breakout rooms and other things too. But we also have to consider the rest of the story, because the early release of prisoners is not just by itself. In some jurisdictions, there are victims' rights protections, where the victims have a right to be notified in advance if a perpetrator is going to be released. And so you have to schedule that, give notice, and a lot of the releases happened without that. So the victims found out after the fact that the perpetrators had been released. But we have to consider whether we need adjustments to that law or improvements in the procedures.
So, I mean, there are concerns on both sides with regard to releasing people. How do you release people in a pandemic? What do you do about people who do not have family members to go to live with? What do you do about the fact that the service providers are reluctant to take people from carceral institutions because they are afraid that they will bring with them the virus, and that they will not have the supports that they need? You can't just let people go free if they can't fend for themselves, or if the supports are not there. What do we do about the next layer? There's the next layer up, in the sense that the processing of releases certainly requires more input from lawyers and social workers. And then once you release someone, it's not clear that they are going to communities that will have the resources to provide for them. These communities may not have the resources to provide for the general population. The system is integrated, and to what extent is COVID exposing the way in which we have perhaps focused on incarceration to the detriment of other aspects that are important to actually getting people back on the road of a good life through law abidingness, I guess you could say. Professor Dunkel?
you're right. This is a problem in the cases we also had that some of these short-term prisoners not paying a fine, they are in a very desperate situation, not only financially, but also with having no relatives, no place to live, no accommodation, and so on. So this is was and is a real task for the probation and aftercare services and for the services of the communities in order to provide accommodation and so on. But in a social welfare state, which we are somehow, and some of the other European countries, we have these network systems of social support by either the criminal justice agencies, probation and aftercare services, but also by these voluntary organizations, charity organizations. And what is a real problem, how accommodation, we need some kind of halfway house, which are able to keep them safe and calm residents. But this is the task of our state and of the communities to provide for these people some support. And indeed, the probation services are understaffed anyway, also in our country. I mean, Italy probably the same. And so we have problems with that. It's not so easy to, we cannot just throw people out of the prison without any social support, social work support, and so on. So this is to be taken into account here.
I'm going to ask Francesca to join us again with some questions that have been put in the chat. Francesca.
Yes, thank you so much, all our panelists, for that lovely discussion. We did have a question that sort of follows up on this, is whether there have been problems recruiting new guards or prison guards or people to work within the prison system, or whether there's been a number of people leaving the prison system. And we're wondering if that's had an impact on the lives of prisoners or the prison system as a whole.
Yes.
Elaborate.
How does one address that? Yes.
It's hard to be a prison guard in the first place. It's a job that not a lot of people want to do for a long time, and the situation of working in an environment where COVID is rampant has really been very difficult. It may change with the vaccine, but right now it's a very difficult point, and the questioner is right to remark upon that.
Is this something that's been happening also in Germany and in Italy in particular?
No, I think prison guards are quite, yeah, they won't just leave the service because of fear of being infected. And so we had very few reports that some just said, I'm sick, I cannot come to my work anymore. But this is very individual cases. I think they are what I don't know. They are civil servants. They cannot be fired. I mean, so it is a very safe working place, and you just don't leave it. They have a 2 years education. It's very different from the United States. They are really having kind of university degree, if you want, or a college degree. So I mean, this is different, and they are also. I would not say that they have a very high social ranking in the society, but it's they are not they are somehow recognized as doing an important work in the society. So I think this is not a real problem in Germany. And what about Italy?
As of Italy, well, actually, I was looking at the data, the official data, and the number of prison guards who are positive to coronavirus are slightly higher than the numbers of the prison population. So they have been apparently more exposed, maybe because they have more, of course, external contacts too, whereas prison population hasn't. But they fear, as the inmates, about this situation to be so exposed. And so the situation is very tense inside the facilities. But I would also like to point out how the other prison staff is less present inside the facilities. Some of them are working from home, and this makes everything very complicated in facilities that are not meant to have like internet connection, and this is slowing down all the reports that are necessary to the judicial authorities to release prisoners, even thanks to this very special, extraordinary temporary measures. And also the social workers working in the connection from inside and outside are also not working as much as they did before because of the pandemic. And this is also causing the inaccessibility of measures that are legally there, but they are not really reducing the number of the prison population. Of course, it did, a reduction did occur, but absolutely not enough, because not enough due also to the fact that we have this overpopulation. Prison overcrowding is a before COVID problem. So, and also all the recruitment is suspended now because no examinations for prison staff is being carried out because of the pandemic. And so we cannot have new personnel being enrolled and recruited.
Thank you. That's very interesting to hear the different perspectives. And we also got another question about whether there are any sort of procedural things that were put in place before the pandemic that have now been put to the side. Professor Wojcik, you mentioned these hearings for the victims and that they're no longer happening. And the audience was wondering if there's anything else.
I don't know
like
that. I don't know that they're. I can't give a blanket answer for every jurisdiction if they're not happening. But I know that many people were released without the victim hearings happening. One thing that there was movement before, and it's the reason for doing it is even increased now with COVID, is the elimination of cash bail in the United States. That so many people are remaining behind bars because they don't have the $1,000, the $5,000 to post bail. But the judges can look at other aspects of it, where they live, if they have family, if they have connections to the community, if they have a job. There's other guarantees that will ensure someone's return to the courtroom, other than the payment of cash bail, which for some people is raised by GoFundMe pages. I think that that's a good development that I hope we see more of, this bail reform work. I wanted to just ask a question on behalf of all the people watching who would be interested in getting another chance to read Professor Dunkel's slides. Are those being made available to them?
Yes, we will email them to all the attendees as well as the panelists. Yes, do you think that there are any sort of procedural changes that will maintain even after the pandemic is over? Also in Germany or in Italy, have there been any procedural changes, and do you think that those would last long term?
Well, the changes in the procedural, development were that we have hearings of pre-trial hearings and also other communication between lawyers and defendants that will be used also after the pandemic. We have, for example, the regularly before an early release, the court of the execution of punishments. So this is a special court who is responsible for this. It's the parole decision in your country. This is a court. It's professional judges, and they have regularly they make hearings with the prisoners, and in the future they will much more having these hearings on video, Zoom meetings or something like that. And this will be was said already that they keep that. Also, the lawyers must not have this difficult procedure to enter the prison and going through all the ways inside prisons. That can be improved by just having a talk on Zoom or so. But we have to be careful in other areas of the prison life. I mean, we cannot replace the personal meeting of a social worker or of a psychotherapist with a prisoner by a Zoom meeting. I mean, this is all working in the social fields of therapy, of social work, and so on. Tell us that you can do it for a time via Zoom, but this is not enough for the kind of rehabilitative work. I mean, we don't have the bail system. We have a totally different approach to pre-trial detention. It's the absolute exception only if there's a fear of escape or a fear of repetition of serious crimes. So we have a comparatively low proportions of pre-trial detention. Different in Italy, I know, and in other European states, but in our country, we use it very rarely. And in the time of the pandemic, we know that the judges were even more reluctant to impose pre-trial detention because it was clear that pre-trial detention means 23 hours per day in your own cell without any contact apart from the 1 hour of walking around in the prison yard. And then this, therefore, the judges were very sensible about this and used it only as a last resort. And this is anyway recommendable. Yeah. So, okay.
Have you noticed that in Italy? Oh, yes, of course.
One more thing I'd like to see change is that jury selection, I think, could be done online. Instead of having people come down and sit in the courtroom all day in the jury waiting room, they could do it online, and that would be much more efficient, and people would be more inclined to participate if they knew that it wasn't a full day loss like that.
Definitely.
As of Italy, I think that proceedings and hearings will go back face-to-face fully. We already had issues with video conferences for defendants who had been accused of organized crime, mafia crimes. This has been used before the pandemic, and it is there is a claim that this is reducing the rights of the defense. And so I think we will go back in the old way and not use all these measures after the pandemic is over.
Great. Well, thank you so much all for being here and for this great discussion. I want to thank you on behalf of myself and on behalf of the journal. And we look forward to hopefully collaborating again in the future. And we'll have a brief break again now for about 15 minutes. And we'll begin again at 4 with the next panel. But yes, thank you to all our panelists. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also.
Thank
I would
you.
like to meet my colleagues of the panel maybe by email, and maybe we can exchange each other, and also those in your journal who are interested in further contacts. Thank you. It was a
Definitely.
nice
I'll make
meeting.
sure to share everybody's information.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Austin, for moderating. Thank you, dear colleagues, and Francesca.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
The last CLE password for this event will be Penal. Again, the last CLE passcode for this event is Penal. We'll see you at the next event.
Hayden, thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you for inviting both me and Professor Capers to participate today. It's a real joy to be in conversation in this comparative way. It's not really a forum in which, and a topic in which I can explore these issues. I have lots of thoughts, and I know Professor Caper does as well. So I'm just so appreciative of this opportunity. Yes, I am. Those are lots of titles thrown around. I hope I could live up to all of them. But I think what's the most recent part of my bio is that I'm actually moving to Brooklyn Law School in the fall. And so I'll be a professor of law there, teaching criminal law, criminal procedure and evidence. And I really hope to take the themes that we will be discussing today into the classroom with me. As you mentioned, I come to academia from practice, as does Professor Capers, and I think that gives us a unique perspective on these issues. I started as a capital post-conviction attorney, so I represented people that had already been convicted and sentenced to death, and then I was seeking relief for them in federal court. So those of you that have taken Fed courts and suffered through the lecture on habeas corpus, that was my jam for 9 years. Then I went to the Legal Defense Fund, and that's where I broadened my advocacy outside of just the criminal legal system, outside of just capital defense, and looked at really promoting, defending, and advancing the rights of Black people for the goal of creating a more just society for everyone, a more inclusive society for everyone. At Columbia, I teach courses in movement lawyering, abolition, capital post-conviction defense. And in all of those classes, I talk about bias, racism, specifically anti-Black racism as it plays out in the criminal legal system in this country, which is very unique. And I know we'll get into this in our discussion. Even though I teach a class on abolition, I am as much of a student of abolition as I am a teacher. I think it's a really powerful tool, a real powerful theoretical framework that we can use to examine some of the issues in our legal system, and then a tool that we can use to potentially discuss reform, transformational change. And it's exciting to me. I think when Bennett and I were in law school, people weren't talking about transformational change. We were eager to work within the system. I started as a federal public defender. Bennett was a U.S. attorney at USA. I was AFPD. And we were very happy to work within that system. And I think today's students, your peers, you're discussing, how do I take down the system and still operate in some way within it? Because the way that our very carceral focused, punitive focused system works, I think we're all sort of have this increased awareness that it's not sustainable. And we look at the incarceration rates of other countries based on what goes on in this country, and why are we such an outlier with the death penalty? Why are we such an outlier with not just incarceration rates, but length of incarceration? Why do we treat children the way that we treat them within the criminal legal system? And so I'm excited that Hayden, you are looking at these issues, that your colleagues in the journal and that the students at Penn are examining these issues. My scholarship is really interested in picking apart the jurisprudence that purports to be race neutral within the criminal legal system. I'm interested in questioning the neutrality of these legal standards. Who is a reasonable person? We cannot divorce this concept of reasonableness from the social, historical context of this country. And so those are questions I'm still grappling with. I have a forthcoming article in the NYU Law Review looking at anti-Black bias among defense counsel. I'm turning the mirror inward. We talk lots about anti-Black bias among prosecutors, among police officers, among jurors, among judges. What about defense counsel? What if we had a system in which indigent Black defendants were able to choose counsel and they prioritized racial congruency? My article is called Black on Black Representation, and I argue that sort of match, or even just culturally competent defense counsel, can help combat some of these issues that we see within our criminal legal system. However, that said, I'm also really wary of interventions that merely prop up and serve to legitimize the criminal legal system. And so I want to push my own scholarship, my own research further into looking more at what kind of dismantling I can suggest as an intervention. And I know we'll get to that sort of the end of our conversation, but I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm excited to be in conversation with Professor Capers.
We're thrilled to have you. Thank you. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. Professor Capers, if you'd like to go ahead.
Sure, I'm thrilled to be here as well. And thank you, Hayden, for organizing this. Thanks to the Journal of International Law for putting this together. And I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with my friend Alexis, because I'm a big fan of her work. And I love how she is. I think the great thing about our community is, we're pushing each other to sort of think differently about the criminal justice system, which we're not even calling criminal justice system anymore. I mean, we're calling it the criminal injustice system or the criminal system or something, and pushing us to think more about other alternatives, other ways of doing things. So you asked us to speak for a few minutes about ourselves. That's the one thing I'm sort of inwardly cringing, because I hate speaking about myself. Like, I could do it on paper, but like doing it this way just seems, it's not me. But hopefully the people in the audience have my bio. I think what I will say, though, this sort of dovetails with what Alexis was saying. I'm going to speak for a second just about my pre-academic background as a federal prosecutor, because one of the things I find sort of shocking to me is just how natural it felt, how oblivious I was to the idea that I might be participating in or contributing to mass incarceration. Like, all of that was so outside of sort of what I was aware of at the time. And I think we were all like that. We were all participating in sort of mass incarceration, which is happening so gradually we did not even notice it. I was also completely blind in a way, just comparatively, like how this country was doing compared to other countries. I will tell you, just a few days ago, I think, or maybe last week, I was moderating a panel at my own institution by my institution's own Journal of International Law, which was on Black Lives Matter and internationally, which was sort of eye-opening just to moderate. I think one thing that's fascinating is how sort of the protests this summer, which were so international, sort of brought sort of what's going on around the world into sharper focus. So I learned a lot from that panel. I've been thinking about it. But I'm going to say up front, it's not my expertise. So I'm a student of what's going on internationally.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. It's very nice to hear you say that you were blind to some of these things when you were working before, because I mean, that's 100% an experience that I relate to, and I'm sure a lot of people in our audience can relate to as well. And hearing somebody admit that it's powerful, and it gives you, courage and the ability to do so yourself. So I wanted to start off this discussion by trying to get everybody on the same foundation, make it a little bit of a level playing field of a discussion. So the first question I have revolves around the United States being a global leader in incarceration, both in terms of the number of people incarcerated, about 2.2 million, and our rate of incarceration. We have only 5% of the world's population, but only almost 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have the highest prison population rate, second only to the Seychelles, and that's 698 people for every 100,000. On the other hand, 54% of the world incarcerates less than 150 people for every 100,000. And I wanted to get your perspectives on why you think we incarcerate so many and maybe what we're doing differently than these other places that makes that number so high. And Professor Hogue, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I think about this a lot, and particularly when I travel. And I tend to, as I travel, ask for sort of like a tour guide that has a background in history. Like there's this wonderful app that you can use that's like Hire a Local. And I'm always welcome when one of the tour guides is a historian or perhaps has some sort of contact with the legal system, whether as a lawyer, as a student, and I learned so much. And so I'm excited to open up with this question. And I was a student of history. I studied American studies in college, and we do have something unique in this country, in that we were founded really off of disruption of violence, land grab, racial subordination. And I don't think you can look at the way that our legal system operates today separate and apart from that foundation. We have these institutions that really rely on the subordination of Black people, of poor people to prop up capitalism. And you know, there's obviously a lot of scholarship and discussion more recently on this idea that the criminal legal system replaced the institution of slavery as the primary means of controlling Black people and of poor people, Latinx people, really marginalized populations of people. I also think that in this country, we don't think about this idea that the government, that society has a responsibility to provide services to problems. So instead, we rely very heavily on the police to quite literally arrest and lock up our social problems. So as a society, we don't see drug addiction. We don't see adverse childhood experiences, housing and job insecurity as something that the government can address with resources and services. So instead, we rely on police officers to show up and address on the back end. So we're not addressing any of these underlying problems, but instead we have police officers that then arrest, prosecutors that prosecute, and then confine people in prison. And I think, you know, looking at the tax rates, maybe of other Northern European countries that do pay a much higher rate of taxes because they have much more robust social services. They don't have the same level of job insecurity. It's not a perfect system. I don't know what country out there is doing this completely perfectly, but I know there are many countries that are doing this better. And I think that as a culture, as a society, we like to label individual conduct as being something that's inherently bad about the person. And that as society, we don't have a role in somehow providing some sort of services to alleviate the issues that somebody encounters that then commits some sort of engages in some sort of criminal conduct. Bennett, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I have to say one reason why I love this question is I'm thinking every time I teach criminal law, the first class, one of the things I mention are sort of the statistics you mentioned, Hayden, and other statistics about how much we incarcerate and how that compares internationally and how it's distributed by gender and race and class and mental illness. But I don't really go beyond that in class. I'm asking why. And it's a great question. My guess is you could devote like a week-long, symposium on just that topic. And at the end, there would still be no settled answer. So one thing I'm going to say up front, though, is it's sort of interesting to me that we think of our country as being incredibly punitive now and incarcerating a lot now, but we also have to recognize that it wasn't always the case. So if we're looking at, a snapshot of like adopting 3 strikes laws and embracing sentences of life without parole and creating sex offender registries or passing the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, then the view of us as being really punitive, we would all agree. But it seems less true when you take a longer view. So Joshua Kleinfeld at Northwestern has persuasively argued that like between 1770s and the 1970s, so for 2 centuries, the American criminal justice system was for the most part, he uses the word reasonable compassion, wasn't that punitive. That being said, the one exception during those 2 centuries was race. And that remains the exception today. So that's the difficulty. So Alexis talked about several reasons why the incarceration rate is so high now. I'm just going to add a few more. Like, we're in a system where we elect judges and prosecutors and they run on tough on crime ballots. We, do law and order rhetoric. The whole war on drugs is really should be thought of as a race war on drugs. It's really all about race. We love guns in this country. We can't ignore that. And also the way we incarcerate, we tend to externalize the costs. So cities don't really bear the cost of incarceration, states do. So if you could have a city where lots of people are getting locked up and the district attorney doesn't have to worry about that. The mayor doesn't have to worry about that because the state is picking up the bill. So there's so much going on. And obviously in the 1970s, we abandoned rehabilitation and just said oh, it doesn't work, as if prison does. So that's where we are. The one more thing I want to mention, the other thing I want to mention, Hayden and Alexis, is it's sort of interesting thinking about the variation internally. So the last time I checked, Oklahoma has the highest incarceration rate in the country. Massachusetts has the lowest. Why is that? Who knows? It's all politics local. It's all criminal law enforcement local. It certainly doesn't help that we have 18,000 or so different police departments. And by the way, I mentioned Massachusetts has the lowest incarceration rate in the country. I was reading something that said that if you treated Massachusetts as a state, as a country, Massachusetts would rank ninth out of all the other countries. So even though Massachusetts has a low incarceration rate relatively, it's still 2.5 times greater or so than the United Kingdom's incarceration rate. So, we incarcerate in this country. And I guess the question that we're still struggling with is there's so many reasons why that it's hard to pinpoint one reason, and it's hard to disentangle any of these reasons and say if we fixed X or fixed Y, we would solve the problem.
Thank you both for your perspectives on that. And one thing that I noticed when both of you were talking was that, the question obviously lent itself to an overwhelmingly negative evaluation. But I'm curious to hear if there's anything in our criminal justice or criminal injustice system that gives you hope for the future. Is there anything, we hear a lot about systemic racism right now, and so many of us are learning about that for the first time. Are there any things that are systemically good, that are systemically combating systemic racism?
I don't know about systemically, but there are some efforts, really meaningful efforts, and I'm so glad Bennett mentioned Oklahoma. So what's not talked about often in this narrative of mass incarceration is the rate of incarceration of women, and how for women specifically, it has gone up. I think it's 750, almost 800% since the late 1970s. And Oklahoma not only has the highest incarceration rate, but the highest incarceration rate for women. And you look at an organization like Bronx Defenders, which was started in the late 90s as a holistic public defender office. It was going to be located right in the heart of the South Bronx, not in the courthouse, not next door to the prosecutor's office. And it was going to offer services that helped their client face any number of issues that they were dealing with beyond just the contact with the criminal legal system. So with immigration, housing, family law, any number of things. And so this model Robin Steinberg, brought that to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and started an organization called Still She Rises. And the funding is earmarked to allow services, holistic wraparound services, to this massive population of women in Oklahoma that has high contact with the criminal legal system, and who also happen to be a primary caretaker of minors, of children. And so I see this response happening, which is heartening to me. I think that's a positive. But the thing that I am most excited about is that, you know, Ben and I get invited to talk at law schools and have these discussions about, and then what's next? And I have my students that sign up, lots of students, more than I could fit in my class, my virtual class, to take abolition, and are asking these hard questions about how is it that we can address these looming issues. Bennett talked about his own experience as an AUSA. We weren't questioning, I wasn't questioning my role as a public defender. And I look at Nicole Futrell-Smith's article, she's at CUNY Law, and that's coming out, I think, this year, but adopting an abolitionist framework in a criminal defense clinic. Let's talk about that in the practice and pedagogy of criminal defense lawyering. This was nowhere in the curriculum. This was nowhere in the discussion, you know, and I realized I like to say, oh, I was in law school like just yesterday. It was 13 years ago. But, you know, and I just this fundamental shift. And I think too, you know, I came sort of age watching like Law and Order and Cops. And the beginning of Law and Order is like there's two sides to every story. There's the police and the prosecution. It's like, well, that's actually the same side. But I think now about the things that are out there in popular culture for lay people, and that also our law students, you know, have been watching and exposed to. And it's Ava DuVernay's 13th. It's Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. It's Just Mercy, both as a book and as a film. You know, Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, about the Central Park 5 case and the Central Park rape case. And so I am hopeful. You all are approaching this with a totally different mindset. And you all are going to be defense attorneys, lawmakers, prosecutors, judges, and then also the head of these organizations that are thinking about how do we get away from a carceral focused society.
Professor Capers, if I may, just in the middle, wanted to quickly say the CLE passcode for the first half of this panel. Right now, the passcode is policy. Again, the passcode is policy, and there will be just one more left. Thank you.
No problem. So if I could,
yeah.
So if I could chime in, because in all honesty, I think I go back and forth between being pessimistic and optimistic. And so that I won't sound too much like a downer, I will start with the pessimistic part and then move to the optimistic part. So the pessimistic part is, you know, I'm also like a critical race theory guy. So you know, I sort of cut my teeth on, you know, Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, which basically says the only time racial progress really happens is when it's in the interest of white elites. So unless there's some kind of convergence between what will benefit white elites and sort of what will benefit racial minorities, it doesn't happen. So that's part of the pessimistic part. I can throw in there, I mean, let's all admit it. We've just been through 4 years of Trump. You know, talk about retrenchment. I mean, you know, recently I heard on the media, on NPR, Brooke Gladstone said something that really hit home to me. She said she thinks Trump's legacy won't be the lies he told, but the truth he revealed about who we are. So I'm still stuck with that. That's the pessimistic part. The optimistic part is just like Alexis said. It's really all of you. So I will add to what Alexis said. You know, it used to be that, you know, first day of class when I'm teaching criminal law or criminal procedure, I would also ask my students like, oh, how many of you think you might want to be prosecutors? How many of you think you might want to be defense lawyers? How many of you think you might want to be judges? This year, I sort of told this, well, I don't even remember. I think I told the students, I'm not even going to ask those questions. So I think I might have, but I said, the real thing I want to ask you is, how many of you want to change the criminal system? And what surprised me was like, I don't know if they were just like, sucking up to me or what, but, out of like 90 students, imagine 80 students saying, I want to change the system. And that could be as a citizen, it could be as a prosecutor, it could be as a defense lawyer, but, there seems to be this growing dissatisfaction with the status quo. So that gives me some optimism that change is possible.
Well, I'm glad to hear that even if it's not systemic, that there is hope, and it seems that maybe we're on the right path. So I actually want to jump ahead a little bit in the plan that I'd given to you both to talk about more specifically about race and international issues in that sense. So many individuals are subject to police brutality here in America. And those problems are not unique to the United States. For example, children that live on the streets of India are routinely beaten and sometimes killed by the police. In Brazil, for every 229 suspects that are arrested by the police, one suspect is killed. Compare that statistic with the United States, where for every 31,575 suspects arrested by the police, one suspect is killed. But I don't think it's possible to describe that problem just using statistics. And I wanted to ask you both, is there one factor that causes these problems? Is it a consistent set of factors around the world? Or do you think those factors are unique to each system, each population? Professor Capers, we can start with you.
Oh, I was hoping you start with Alexis. I don't.
Two quick thoughts, and I can volley it right back to you, Bennett.
So do you want to go first, Alexis, or?
Well, the one commonality I see with India, Brazil, and the US is that we have these deeply entrenched histories of subjugation of disfavored groups of people. And so the caste system in India, the Dalit are the untouchables. And I don't know the caste breakdown of those statistics, but something would tell me that those are mostly lower caste individuals that have that high contact with the criminal legal system. And then in Brazil, there's an interesting history with Brazil. It received more enslaved people, really, than the United States. And you look at Salvador in the north, it's a city, the capital is Bahia. And then Rio, same like New York, it's the same as the city, and the state is the same name. But in the north, I want to say it's Salvador received the highest number of enslaved Africans from West Africa, and as opposed to having sort of forced legal segregation that we experience in the United States, Brazil had this sort of integration and eugenics going on. And so there was a real embrace and a favoritism of whiteness. And there was actually encouragement for miscegenation to lighten the population. And so when I think about who, again, the data that's coming from Brazil, something tells me it's probably people that are phenotypically darker skinned because they experienced many of the same sort of social issues that Black Americans and Latinx and people of color experience in this country. And so that's a commonality I see that runs throughout each of them. And then, the United States, it looks like our numbers are better with police contact, but I mean, as Bennett knows, the data is not great on use of force with just citizens and the police. It's not widely collected. We know data from police departments that have been sued because they have to collect it. So we know it from the NYPD, we know it from Oakland, Chicago, but there are 18,000 police departments in this country, and we don't have that kind of data for everyone. So I would argue that our numbers are probably higher than what's reported.
Yeah, and I will just add, part of the other problem is, we can look at certain countries and sort of the ones you mentioned and sort of see sort of extreme sort of numbers. But then we also sort of see sort of anti-Black or anti-minority policing sort of almost like so many places. So the panel I moderated last week had experts from France and Switzerland and the United Kingdom talking about what's going on there. And sure, it's not as extreme, but you still have sort of same kind of policing. And, you know, throughout Europe, it doesn't necessarily have to be Black, it could be the Roma, it could be anybody, but there seems to be this whole, if there's a unifying thing, it seems to be this whole, like, is there an us-them system within the country? Because if there's an us-them system within the country, then it's very easy to think that the police are there for us and to keep us from them. So if that seems to be the dynamic of the country, then you seem to have some kind of problem with policing.
And so then what do we do? You know, how do we get those numbers down? And having done a little bit of work at LDF in the consent decree after the Floyd litigation, stop and frisk litigation, where you know, the New York Police Department was found to be racially discriminatory in the administration of their stop and frisk policy. So stop and frisk is a tool that police officers can lawfully use, but in New York City, the way that they were deploying it was in a racially discriminatory way. And so now we're in like year 8 post-judgment. I should say we, LDF still is, with the Center for Constitutional Rights and some of the other plaintiffs' lawyers. And what is the solution there? So there's a lot of discussion of training, body-worn cameras. Bennett writes a lot in this area. But does that get at the issue? And I think what runs throughout police contact with people in this country, what runs throughout police contact in the countries you mentioned, Hayden, the countries that Professor Capers spoke of, is this presumption of criminality and dangerousness with them. And in this country, it's Black people. And so there is this heightened sense of someone, based on the color of their skin, that they are inherently dangerous. And that's where you get the contact. So if we train police officers, or we take certain tactics off the table, like chokeholds, for instance, like a knee to the neck, and we take that off the table as a tool for police officers to use, there is still going to be violent contact when police officers feel that their lives are in danger. And it can be based on this presumption of dangerousness and criminality. And Brian Stevenson writes about this beautifully in his book. His contact, I mean, he was sitting in his car listening to the radio outside of his apartment after a long day of work. And this is, you know, I realize in New York, we don't have these driveway moments, but, you know, you sit in your car and you listen to the rest of the song, you listen to the rest of This American Life, you know, on NPR. And he has this contact with the legal system with the police officers, because they see him, a Black man, at night, and there's a presumption of. And so what do we do about that? We have to have some sort of larger scale reckoning. So we can have some sort of reconciliation, and EJI is doing really great work with this. And, you know, Brian is a student of the process post-Holocaust in Germany. He's a student of, you know, what happened in South Africa. And the reconciliation that came together, people publicly admitting their participation in racial violence and atrocities, and asking for some sort of forgiveness, really, looking at the efforts in Rwanda post-genocide. And I think, you know, other countries are looking at how to reckon with their racial violence in a way that the United States, just on a big scale, hasn't yet done.
And if I can, sorry, Hayden, I also wonder if we want to also expand it beyond police violence, beyond racial violence, because you know, it also seems like beyond sort of certain people being deemed inherently dangerous, certain people are just deemed a problem. So even if it doesn't involve, you know, physical force, there's still increased rates of incarceration. So, you know, we all know that in Canada, there's a problem with the incarceration rates of Indigenous people. I don't know if that has anything to do with violence, but it does probably have a lot with them being just perceived as a problem. And we see that, you know, in lots of places.
So since you mentioned the Indigenous population in Canada, and we're talking generally about incarceration here, I would love to drill down a little deeper into that specific issue. Canada, like you said, the United States, like we all know, as well as the United Kingdom, have well-documented racial and ethnic disparities in incarceration rates. These trends are also present in Aboriginal incarceration in Australia and Maori incarceration in New Zealand. So in addition to the impact that actual imprisonment has on the individual and the community, incarcerated persons lose many of the rights and privileges that the unincarcerated person enjoys. In America, our constitutional right to vote in a lot of places. Is there any justification for taking these rights away? Any legitimate reason other than to perhaps limit these undesirable groups that we're talking about, quote unquote undesirable groups that we're talking about?
I mean, I'm sure if we were in some sort of debate, someone could come up with, like a positive policy reason. This country is so punitive in terms of the rights that we take away from people after a criminal conviction. Sometimes after really an arrest can trigger someone's ineligibility for work based on the internal policies, the hiring policies of an organization. But I think the way that we hear about it the most maybe in this country, people who are incarcerated, returning to sort of free society outside experience this in a whole other way. But I think the lay people that maybe haven't had the contact with the criminal legal system, we hear about it through voting disenfranchisement. That's baked into our Constitution. The 15th Amendment extends the right to vote, or rather takes away prior servitude as a barrier to voting. But it carves out and says that you can lose this right as if you had contact or conviction with the criminal sort of legal system. And so it was really always tied to this idea of citizenship, and that you were less of a citizen. There's something diminished about you and your ability to participate in civic life when you have a criminal conviction. And I think about this idea of citizenship and how it was always tied. It was tied to race in this country. Black people couldn't vote. We couldn't serve on juries. And these are two markers of citizenship that operate with us today. And even though Black people can vote and serve on juries, look at the numbers in the jury pools and who was eligible to serve on juries. We had policies in place where Black people couldn't testify against a white person in court. I'm talking about very early sort of colonial laws. And then today, we impeach witnesses based on their prior convictions, and who does that disproportionately impact? And so we have a long history of stripping away citizenship from people based on criminal convictions. And it's really ironic because many of the first colonists, who came here from England, they had criminal convictions. They were like booted out of England, go settle, the new world out there. Brazil, the Portuguese sent people that had criminal convictions to settle this new colony. And then today, what are we doing? Who is allowed to be a citizen? And I think in all of these countries that you mentioned, these colonized countries, we're really carving out who is allowed to be a citizen and tying it to criminal convictions and contact with the criminal legal system to exclude people of color, Native people from who gets to vote and serve on juries and all the other benefits that go along with citizenship.
Professor Capers, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly, one of the things I find myself increasingly doing is going back to sort of my critical race theory approach to things. And for me, something that's foundational to critical race theory is constantly asking who benefits and who does not. So with respect to your question, Hayden, I'm just thinking, well, who benefits from the current criminal system? Who benefits from these collateral consequences and who does not? And it's, by thinking about who benefits that we can begin to sort of like challenge these inequities. So, if people are being disenfranchised, who benefits, who does not? I'll leave it at that.
So Professor Hoag mentioned this idea of punitiveness, and I think you got it at it a little bit as well, Professor Capers. Maybe our system isn't designed to be punitive, but it's designed to do something else. And one of the general indicators of how punitive a country is its incarceration rate. But it's only a broad brush. It doesn't really tell you incredibly accurately if those punitive goals are succeeding or not. It doesn't take into account levels of crime or the efficiency of law enforcement in responding to that crime. How accurate are incarceration rates as an indicator of punitiveness in America or the rest of the world? Is there a reason that does our desire to punish or our desire to achieve another goal contribute to the inflated rates we see? And it's open to either of you.
I'm going to, before I punt and turn it over to Alexis, I'm just going to, I think, add to the question or add to the issue, because the other thing I just want to point out is, our jails cycle through about 10 million misdemeanor cases a year. Right now, 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. So it has almost nothing to do with rates of crime. It is completely separate from rates of crime. The fact that so many of us have arrest records. Almost everybody on this Zoom call probably knows somebody with an arrest record. And that says something about us as a country. We make everything a crime or a violation. There are now over 4,000 separate federal crimes in the US federal code. Almost half of those crimes were added to the books after 1970. So and again, just to return to a point Alexis made earlier, we use criminal law as like a substitute safety net. So instead of dealing with real issues, we just invoke the criminal law for everything. So that doesn't answer your question. It sort of like changes the question a little bit. Sorry.
Oh, that's wonderful. Please, you are the expert, and I'm just here to give everybody an opportunity to hear you speak.
And I'm taking notes too. Yeah, I mean, but it's right. It doesn't tell the whole story, and he's added more to that story. And that's the number we often focus on is who's incarcerated in prisons. And so this is once you are convicted and then sent to prison and have a sentence. And it's that 2.4 million number. But Bennett's right. I mean, there's over 10 million people, and some of these are repeat. Many of them are repeat folks who are being arrested and confined temporarily or for long periods of time because they can't make bail pending this trial. And there's no sort of urgency really to go to trial on some of these low-level offenses. But that's a huge number. I mean, it's hard for me to even wrap my mind around what 10 million is and what that looks like. It also doesn't look at sort of our attitude and view of young people, because all of these trends and numbers that we discuss with adults, it starts very early on. And when I look at, some of the work I was doing at LDF was on these post-Brown versus Board of Education cases. So there were school districts that were found to have be in violation of Brown versus Board of Education. A district court issued a consent decree and said, school district, you have to meet all of this different criteria, and then we can lift the decree. And so here we are 50 plus years later, and these school districts are still under these consent decrees. And now they want to go back to court to lift the consent decree. And so attorneys at LDF come in and say, okay, well, hold on, let's look at this data. Lauderdale County, this is in Mississippi, it's Meridian, Mississippi. It's where the 3 civil rights workers nearby were murdered, lynched essentially. Still today in 2021, in Lauderdale County, there are police officers, school resource officers in schools. And instead of, getting a write-up to go to the principal's office, children get write-ups to report to the Lauderdale County Juvenile Justice Center. And I mean, that is, I don't know how many folks on the call went to schools where you had police officers as just part of the fabric of the school in the hallway. Who are they keeping safe from who? And this idea that we are literally funneling. We talk about the school to prison pipeline, and we are funneling children for write-ups on dress code violations, on speaking out of turn in class, to go to the juvenile court. First graders, second graders, and in case it was a question, these are overwhelmingly Black children. And so the statistics that you rattled off about, our country's sort of incarceration rates, does it talk about how punitive we are? No, it does not tell. I'm too like Bennett, adding more, to the story. But we as a country, we are very unique. And I'm sure this came up during the panel that Bennett was moderating. We are very unique in the way that we treat children. We are the only country, and Brian Stevenson at EJI is really focused on this issue, the only country where children are essentially sentenced to die in prison. They receive the sentence of LWOP, life without the opportunity of parole. That should bother all of us. In Tennessee, a life sentence is 51 years. So you can be, under the age of 18 and receive a life sentence for a crime, and you are not eligible for parole for 51 years? So not just the incarceration rates, but the length of the sentences that we impose, and then how early it is that we ensnarl children in the criminal legal system. I think that speaks much more to our punitiveness than just the numbers of incarceration, those incarcerated.
Well, thank you both for expanding my question and adding so much more to it. I appreciate it so greatly. And now that we've laid this very, very solid foundation, I'd like to move into the future and get your thoughts and views on that. Over the last year, there have been louder and louder cries to defund the police due to racism within the criminal legal system that disproportionately targets individuals and communities of color. You just spoke about it, Professor Hoag, sending children to the police for school infractions, something that I'd never even heard of when I was a school-aged person. And many defund the police proposals do look very different from one another. Professor Hoag, you've recently written about anti-racist, anti-carceral, and anti-capitalist abolition within the criminal legal system. And Professor Capers, you wrote about policing in the year 2044, when America is projected to be a majority-minority country. I would love to hear what you think the future of criminal justice and policing looks like. Is there an ideal path that we can take, in your opinion? And if so, are we on that path? What do we have to do to get on it? Professor Capers, if you'd like to start.
Again, I was hoping you'd start with Professor Hoag.
All right, Professor Hoag, please start.
I taught Bennett's article, Afrofuturism Policing in 2044, alongside Derek Bell's Space Traders. And we also watched Kirby Jean Ramon. He's a fashion designer of Pyre Moss is his line. And he directed this music video called Sue Me by Wale. And it depicts this future where white people are on the receiving end of over-policing, over-incarceration, and are housing and food insecure. It's like an 8-minute video. So this was all part of this futurism, Afrofuturism unit in the movement Loring class. And the students were critical of where Bennett came with his Afrofuturist take. And they really pushed back on that the future has a lot of technology in it, and monitoring and surveillance. And they were, they were on board with you for so much, except for the increased surveillance. But
now you tell me.
But we are in a different moment. I mean, I bet that your take may be a little. There were things you may change about that article. I'm thinking, it was published in 2018.
Yes.
I mean, think about everything, how fundamentally, so much has changed in the conversation, the awareness post sort of George Floyd's murder. And I mean, the awareness and conversations haven't changed among Black people. I mean, this is like this heightened sense of awareness. Like, yes, we know this is the experience we have within the criminal legal system, but there's like massive increase of awareness and support of Black Lives Matter, which was referred to as such disdain, you know, just a few years ago by most of the people in this country. And so, I mean, there is a shift. And I'm only so lucky, Bennett, that I had your article to pick from, to put on my syllabus. I mean, there's only so much scholarship out there, legal scholarship, that really embraces Afrofuturism. So I was happy that my students could read it and critique it. I mean, that it existed as a learning tool. So I don't mean that, you know, in any kind of way than just thank you. You know, this idea of defund the police, you know, the second part of that really gets left out of this conversation, this rallying call, is then where do we reinvest that money? And Allegra McLeod calls this justice, you know, reinvestment. So we take that money away, but then where do we put it? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, when she talks about prison abolition, she says it's not just about an absence. What do we put in place? And I think when we just say defund the police, which Obama was very critical of, you know, he had that sort of glib response to it. It's because the second half is missing, you know, from the quick sort of comment, defund the police. And I think, you know, for people that have been thinking critically about these issues, in academia, outside of academia, in policy spaces, they are thinking, where do we put this money? It was news to me that the NYPD operating budget was $6 billion with a B dollars. And so if we took away, you know, an 18th of that, a sixth of that, what could we do with $1 billion in New York City? Perhaps could we address some of this housing insecurity? Perhaps could we address some of the lack of resources for people that have mental health conditions? That would go a long way to addressing this concept of safety, providing safety, and decreasing, you know, maybe criminal conduct that we define as criminal. And so I think that there is room for change. I think that these conversations are happening, and I'm going to put it right back on you, Hayden, and your peers, that you were thinking about these issues in this way that just didn't exist, you know, when Bennett and I were in law school.
So as Professor Hogue pointed out, I'm a big fan of technology, and I still think that technology can do a lot of work in terms of making policing more egalitarian, de-racializing policing, reducing police violence, and also reducing crime. So it's sort of a win-win, except, I mean, as Professor Hogue points out, it does involve technologies that people might find a little bit privacy diminishing. But you know, part of, and, you know, I'll just mention this briefly, part of, since Professor Hogue asked what I would change about the article that came out in 2018, I think one thing I would do differently is emphasize that I'm really about the idea of bringing more diverse people to the table to create technology. So it's called policing in the year 2044 when the country's slated to tip from being majority white to majority minority. But I'm also imagining minorities actually being at the table to decide what kind of, to actually sort of create technology and decide what would benefit everyone. So, you know, it's sort of, I joke now, it's about like, you know, having people of color and giving them the agency to produce technology, to create code, to recode, and to drop a remix. So, you know, that's sort of what I'm imagining. And I will add, because I know a lot of people, I mean, obviously, like, you know, surveillance has done so much to bring racialized policing into the public domain. It was invisible to so many Americans until we had camcorders, and I mean, until we had like cell phone video and stuff like that. But the other thing about technology is technology can really reduce the number of police officers we have and all of that human discretion, which is so filled with biases, both explicit and implicit. So I'm just going to, you know, be a champion of technology still.
Well, as someone who doesn't specialize in technology, I do want to share a very scientific term with our listeners that critiques sort of this idea of surveillance in law enforcement, and it's garbage in, garbage out. And so what, high-tech term I told you, but what it essentially means, which Bennett has addressed, is that when you have basically the people creating the technology that have racial bias, perhaps anti-Black bias, that gets replicated. Then, so it appears, this is neutral sort of technology, but in terms of who develops it, who's instituting it, how it's deployed, it often can reproduce that same sort of bias. And so when Bennett is saying this is what I would add, that's a very important, significant caveat, because you have to have people from diverse backgrounds who aren't going to be maybe necessarily replicating this anti-Black bias in the technology. Yeah.
And if I can just give one concrete example, like everybody complains about facial recognition technology and the difficulty with recognizing Black faces. Facial recognition technology created in Asia has trouble recognizing white faces. It's not the technology, it's who's creating the technology. So that can all be fixed. It's not, it's not inevitably flawed or, permanently flawed. So.
Well, thank you both. One of the things that keeps popping up in my mind while you're speaking about technology and coding and building facial recognition technology and getting more people at the table to build these things is getting the education to get them there, teaching people how to code, teaching people the skills they need to end up at that table. Our keynote speaker, for example, works with prisons in multiple countries in Africa to educate the defenseless. He educates prisoners and prison guards and other prison employees to represent themselves in their communities. And he's seen a huge impact because of that work. And in hearing these calls to defund the police, I was wondering, what's next? Like you mentioned, Professor Hogue. And one of the things I thought was maybe it's education. Maybe we need to spend that money on doing something other than running our police officers through military-style boot camps and putting them out on the streets. So do you see education as a problem in policing? And if so, how do you think we could fix it? Is it something that needs to be more funded as opposed to defunded?
Those are big questions, Hayden. And it sounds like I've opened us up to this area of inquiry. Yeah, it's not just more money at education, but really equalizing access to education. In a former life, I was a college admissions officer, and I would spend some time on the road recruiting, most of the time at my home institution, rejecting these bright, capable young students. But what I noticed when I was doing my recruiting on campus, I would go to the flagship public school. So I covered the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And so I went to Berkeley High School, which is a massive school. I mean, the curriculum there is rivals some university. And when I went into the AP classes and the IB classes, it looked very different than who I saw milling around the hallways. When I went to the flagship school in Portland, Oregon, when I went to the flagship public school in Seattle. So this says nothing about the private schools I also visited, because I was definitely going there too. So we have education. We have these amazing programs, these college preparatory programs, the International Baccalaureate program. I'm sure there are folks that on the call that did IB, way back when, and the AP program. But who has access to the specialized high schools in New York City? 70% of the children in New York City public schools are Black and Latinx. But I want to say the Black population at the flagship Stuyvesant High School is in the single digits. And so it's not just putting more money toward education, it's actually equalizing who has access to these resources. And this is in this country, we prioritize and deprioritize certain things, and it says so much about who we are as a nation. And the fact that we hold separate and apart high quality education that it's not available, it's not accessible to sort of all children. That says something deep about our country.
So Hayden, if you don't mind, I am going to not directly answer your question, but to change the question, like to change the focus altogether. Because for me, I want to educate all of us about policing, which is a separate kind of education. So one question that we haven't been asking ourselves as a country, because we haven't been educating ourselves, is what we want police to do. We don't talk about that. Do we want police officers doing social work? Do we want them issuing traffic tickets? Do we want them responding to noise complaints? Do we want them responding to domestic violence incidents? Like, we don't educate ourselves to even have that conversation. Do we want them looking for drugs? Like, do we care about drugs if we want them to spend whatever portion of their $6 billion budget looking for drugs? And most importantly, for me, do we want them to investigate actual crimes? So my guess is most Americans, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's also true of people on this Zoom call, most Americans do not know that 1 in every 3 homicides in this country goes uncharged. 1 in 3. And it's not just in, inner cities, that's in the suburbs, that's everywhere. Police officers aren't investigating homicides. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, has had something stolen, and I'm sure somebody's reported it to the police. Do you think they spend a lot of time investigating and trying to recover your stolen property or arrest somebody? And don't even get me started on sexual assaults, which are hardly prosecuted at all. So maybe we just need to educate ourselves about what police are actually doing versus what we want them to do. And that's a different kind of education.
What do you want police officers to do?
Me or Alexis?
Well,
I saw the Zoom eye contact directed at you, Bennett.
It does seem like you may have a more developed opinion on it, Professor Capers. So I'll direct that question at you as a follow-up.
So I'm all about downsizing the police. So there's so many tasks that we give to the police that it makes no sense to give to the police. And that includes having police in schools for minor things. It also includes even silly stuff like, do you really need somebody with a gun to issue a traffic ticket? And just going back to technology, we literally do not need anybody handing you a summons at all with the technology we have. We have license plate readers. I mean, we don't even need that. So I would love it if we save police for actually investigating and solving actual crimes. So we don't have them doing social work. We don't have them doing other interventions, especially since our officers are not trained for those other interventions. So we should limit policing to the kind of police work we want them to do, which might be solving crimes. And real crimes, not somebody using recreational use drugs. That's just me.
That sounds pretty good to me. What about you, Professor Hoag?
I am nodding in agreement. And I think a quick knee-jerk critique to defund the police or decrease the size of the police is, well, what do we do about rapes and murders? Police are not preventing rapes and murders now. They show up in response to. And so this idea that suddenly would be fundamentally changed if we decrease the size of the police is just inaccurate. And I think decreasing the footprint and the utility, the need for police in exactly the ways, these concrete ways that Bennett has described, would get us a lot further in decreasing excessive use of force and contact with the police and just individuals. And we would have so much more money available for other things, for other services that would actually help promote safety.
That sounds wonderful. I think that everybody would benefit from a system like that. So we're coming up, we have about 10 minutes left in this panel, and I promised the audience a Q&A. So if it's okay with you both, we'll move into that right now. We have a few questions that have come in over the course of the panel. The first of them is, do you think that there's any way to be a prosecutor and still support change in the criminal, quote, justice system? Professor Capers, I know you were for a little while.
It's funny, I feel like I've been answering that question every day for like the last several days. That seems to be a hot question. Obviously, Paul Butler, who teaches at Georgetown, has famously written that good people should not be prosecutors, because he argues that no matter how much good you try to do, the system will corrupt you, or the system is simply too powerful. You really cannot do anything as a good prosecutor that will make real change. So that's one of the difficulties. That being said, being a prosecutor is still the most powerful way. Prosecutors are the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system. So it might be that the only way to affect any kind of a change is from the inside. But I will answer to whoever put that question. One thing I've been advising students, especially who are thinking about becoming prosecutors, is A, read Paul Butler's chapter first, Should Good People Be Prosecutors? But B, I guess three things. B, this sounds corny as hell, I know, but make a list of like 5 or 10 things that really matter to you and refer to that list periodically so that you can know you're being true to what you think you should be. Instead of, in that way, if you're getting corrupted, you will notice that you're getting corrupted by the system. And then C is, go in with the goal of being the U.S. attorney one day, or the district attorney one day, because those are the people who have real power.
And I think about this increase too in conviction integrity units. In New Orleans, there's a former public defender of the Orleans Parish that was just elected as the DA, the person that Bennett described as having real power. And he hired a former longtime capital defense appellate attorney as the head of this conviction integrity unit. And I think there is real opportunity for good with these units that are then looking at, affirmatively, they are looking at their prosecutions in cases where there may have been evidence withheld, may have been a problematic police officer who secured maybe a confession under suspect circumstances, and doing this hard affirmative work. And it's not necessarily for folks that were innocent of, this crime, but the prosecutor's office adhered to and respect the constitutional rights that criminal defendant was entitled to. And so I think there is room for good for students that are thinking critically about whether or not they should become a prosecutor. But yeah, you are afforded a lot of power, a lot of discretion, and it can be hard when you then become a prosecutor and you have these 5 items that you want to adhere to, but your office culture is such that it pushes you away from those five items. And so I would hope that students that are thinking about becoming prosecutors think about some of these offices that are on the front end, or spouse at least, that they're on the front end of these issues, and they exist. And there's an organization, and Bennett, you might have to remind me of this. I think it's Miriam Krinsky that runs it in Los Angeles. She's a former AUSA on like just and fair prosecution. I think it's an organization. I think it's based in California, but her organization works with district attorneys. I don't know how much work they're doing at the federal level, but to provide resources and training for how to really shift away from, conviction rates as being the driving force of a prosecutor's office. This is hard work because our system was not set up in this way. But I don't think it's impossible to change it.
And if I could just add one more thing, because again, I've been having, I feel like so many of these conversations recently. I'll just say the other thing that I know my students are struggling with, because so many of them are you know, budding abolitionist is they're wondering, how do you become a prosecutor or even a defense lawyer without legitimizing a system that's deeply flawed? And I will say, even as somebody who teaches criminal law and criminal procedure, I'm conflicted. Why am I teaching something that I think is inherently flawed? But you know, that's what we're dealing with.
Well, that's a good transition into the question that I wanted to ask next, which is, you gave advice to become the district attorney, become the U.S. attorney, to try and change the system. We're kind of seeing that happen right now here in Philadelphia with our district attorney, Larry Krasner, but we're also seeing incredible pushback from the FOP, from other political, government, community leaders against the type of changes he's trying to make, the methods he's using to make those changes. I don't want to ask what would you tell Larry Krasner to do it better, but what would you tell somebody that wants to become a DA, that wants to become an AUSA or a U.S. attorney to do in response to that type of pushback when you are at the top, when you are in charge, and you're still being shut down, you're being barred from entering hospitals where victims are lying with gunshot wounds? Do you stay and you keep trying to fight in that position with so much power, or is there somewhere else to go, something else to do? And we have a few minutes left in the panel, so this will be the last question, and please feel free to use it as a springboard into anything else that you think is important to talk about or that you would like to share before we have to log off. And either of you feel free to start, please. I don't want to put anybody in a position of speaking first.
Hayden, I do not have a good answer. I will say that one conference I'm organizing in the fall at Fordham is on subversive lawyering. And I'm a big fan of, sometimes you just have to get your way, but do it sort of on the down low to avoid the pushback. You know, so you know, that's all I can say.
Yeah, it's difficult because as much power as the prosecutor has, they're still dependent on these other members of the criminal legal system, the police officers, their assistant district attorneys. Not everyone left, you know, that didn't buy into Larry Krasner's vision for Philadelphia, and the judges. So, you know, an elected DA, a U.S. attorney can have, you know, an agenda and still have to work within this system. But I think that there are things that DAs are able to do, even in the context of opposition, which is to declare, although I have a footnote on this, but to declare they're not going to seek, you know, the death penalty against individuals. We saw what happened with certain prosecutors who happened to be women, who happened to be Black women, and how much criticism they received when they made that announcement, versus, you know, maybe that someone that doesn't share those identities and is a DA making that kind of announcement. I think that prosecutors who are espousing that they were progressive could have gone a lot harder in the context of COVID. I think that there were a lot of people that were in jails, the 10 million people that Bennett tells us are in and out of jails. Prosecutors were in a unique position to get out on the front end to release those people. And I think even the progressive prosecutors across this country weren't moving fast enough. I think that prosecutors can, you know, decide affirmatively if they're not going to, their office is not going to prosecute certain, you know, low-level offenses. And maybe they're a one-term prosecutor. And that's the reality. They know that they're not going to get reelected. But that's the kind of transformational change that the demonstrators this summer, the millions of people that demonstrated this summer, are demanding. And so the prosecutors do, they have the most power, but it's still, they have to navigate within this system. So these are difficult questions. These are different questions, I think, that the students that come to Ben and I are asking now in this context, in this climate, than they were just a few years ago.
Well, thank you both so much for the answers you were able to give to those questions and the way you were able to expand on them. I know that I am so grateful for the opportunity to listen to you both talk about them and and learn from you both. So Professor Hoag and Professor Capers, I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course, we were so happy to have you.
Yeah, this was a real treat. Obviously to be in conversation with you and your colleagues, but also to be in conversation with Bennett, who I am a very eager student of.
Mutual. It's mutual.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a real treat. Thank you for having us both.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees and participants today. Like I have said over and over again, I feel so enlightened and educated and grateful for this opportunity that we've all had the chance to share today. And with that, we will wrap up the Journal of International Law's annual symposium, International Perspectives on the Future of Incarceration. I see somebody is raising their hand. Let me just one moment.
And meanwhile, I'll give out the last CLE password. So the last CLE password is perspective. Reminder that if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please remember to fill out your digital evaluation form and include the passwords that were announced throughout the event by me. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and I will be linking the evaluation form again in the chat. And I will be online and you can message me if you have any questions. Thanks.
I'm just going to take one moment. Okay, thank you everybody for being here today. Like I said, it was great to have you all, and I hope you all learned just as much as I felt I did. Thank you.